My husband leaned in close at one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York. "Just try not to embarrass me," he hissed, his voice low as he shoved my handbag under the table. "The CEO is about to arrive. He doesn't need to see my unemployed wife dragging me down." I just smiled and took a sip of my water. He had absolutely no idea that the billionaire CEO he was desperately trying to impress, the one he was anxiously waiting for, was about to walk through those doors, bow his head, and call me big sister. "My name is Nora. I'm 34 years old, and until tonight I thought my marriage was just going through a rough patch. I didn't realize it was built entirely on a massive lie. Before we get into the rest of this story, let me know in the comments where you are watching this from. And if you've ever watched an arrogant person completely ruin their own life, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button." Despite the high ceilings and the crystal chandeliers, the private dining room at Leonard felt suffocating. Derek, my husband of 5 years, was literally shaking with nerves. He pulled out a plush velvet chair for his mother, Brenda, and then hurried around the table to do the same for his sister. I stood there waiting for him to at least acknowledge me, but he just snapped his fingers and pointed to the chair closest to the kitchen door. "Sit down, Nora, and please put that cheap bag away," he ordered. I slid into the seat, pulling my simple black leather tote onto my lap. It wasn't cheap. It was a custom Italian piece, a gift from one of my board members, but Derek only recognized loud logos and flashy brands. To him, I was just a housewife, a failed freelance consultant who couldn't even make enough to cover groceries. That was the story he liked, and it was the story I let him believe. It made him feel powerful. Brenda adjusted her heavy pearl necklace and scoffed. "Derek is right, Nora. You really should have dressed up. Look at you, a plain black dress. You look like you're going to a funeral, not the most important dinner of my son's life. You need to understand what is on the line here. Derek is the vice president of business development now. He is stepping into the elite circle. You should feel lucky he even brought you along to experience a place like this." I looked at Brenda. Her entire identity revolved around Derek being her golden boy. For the past 5 years, she had constantly reminded me of how I was holding him back, and how he could have married a woman with a real career. I just nodded politely. I knew exactly what was on the line tonight. What Brenda and Derek didn't know was that the Omnitech contract Derek was sweating over had been sitting on my desk waiting for my review since Tuesday. Derek kept checking his reflection in his phone screen, smoothing his tie. He had spent $10,000 on a custom suit for tonight, charged to a credit card he thought I didn't know about. He was desperately trying to project the image of a seasoned corporate player. He leaned across the table, gripping my wrist. "Listen to me, Nora. When Leo gets here, do not speak unless you are spoken to. Do not talk about your little freelance projects. Do not talk about our house, just smile and nod. If he asks what you do, tell him you manage our home. Do you understand?" I pulled my wrist back, keeping my voice completely calm. "I understand perfectly, Derek. You want me to be invisible." Brenda slammed her water glass down, the ice clinking sharply. "Do not speak to him in that tone. He is under an immense amount of pressure. Do you have any idea how hard he works while you sit at home doing nothing? He carries the financial weight of this entire family. You should be grateful he doesn't make you pay rent to live in his beautiful house." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Financial weight? It was hilarious. Derek made a good salary, but he spent it as fast as he made it on luxury cars, designer watches, and high-end country club memberships just to keep up appearances. The only reason we lived in that beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn was because I paid the entire down payment in cash before we got married. But Derek had convinced his family he was the sole provider and that I was a charity case. I let him keep that illusion, because I used to think peace was more important than being right. But tonight, peace was no longer an option. "You're entirely right, Brenda," I said softly. "Derek certainly works very hard on his image." Derek shot me a harsh glare, his jaw clenching. "I'm warning you, Nora. Omnitech is a billion-dollar unicorn. If I land this partnership, I get a massive promotion and stock options. My entire future relies on Leo seeing me as an equal. Don't ruin this for me with your pathetic jealousy." "I'm not jealous, Derek," I replied, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. "I just hope you actually know what you're doing." He let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I've been analyzing Omnitech for months. I know their entire operation. The only thing I don't know is the identity of their anonymous majority shareholder, but once I connect with Leo, I'll figure that out too." He was so proud of his corporate espionage. He had no idea that the anonymous majority shareholder he was talking about was sitting right across from him, being told to hide her handbag. Just then the heavy oak door of the private room pushed open. Derek instantly stood up, plastering a massive, fake smile on his face. He smoothed his jacket and eagerly stepped forward. "Mr. CEO, it is such an honor," he began, his voice dripping with forced charm. But as Derek saw the man walking through the door, his smile vanished. It wasn't the billionaire tech genius he was waiting to worship. It was Jamal. Jamal was Derek's brother-in-law, a typical aggressive finance guy trying to climb the ladder at a Manhattan brokerage firm. He never missed an opportunity to remind everyone how much money he managed. He swaggered into the room, adjusting the cuffs of his custom shirt to make sure his massive gold Rolex caught the light of the chandelier. He looked at Derek with a smug, arrogant grin, ready to start his own show. Jamal walked slowly toward the table, a sneer on his face. He loved having an audience. Derek let out a long, shaky breath, clearly disappointed that the billionaire CEO hadn't arrived, but quickly covered it up. "Jamal, my man, you made it," Derek said, clapping him on the shoulder. Jamal didn't even look at Derek. His eyes were already locked on me. He pulled out the chair next to Brenda and sat down heavily, resting his elbows on the table so the gold Rolex reflected perfectly. He tapped the watch face with a thick finger. "Just closed a major portfolio restructure for a client in Dubai," Jamal announced, his booming voice echoing in the private room. "They threw in a massive bonus, so I figured, why not upgrade the watch? Do you like it, Derek? It probably costs more than your entire annual bonus if you even get one this year." Derek swallowed hard, his fake smile freezing for a second. "Unbelievable, Jamal, truly impressive." Brenda beamed at her son-in-law. "We are so proud of you, Jamal. What a wonderful life you provide for my daughter. You are a true financial powerhouse." She shot a venomous look at me. "Not everyone understands the pressure that men like you and Derek face." Jamal leaned back, hands behind his head. He looked me up and down with absolute disdain. "It's a tough world, Brenda. You have to be aggressive, you have to be a shark." He paused, locking his eyes onto mine. "Speaking of which, Nora, how is that little freelance consulting gig going? Did you actually make $500 this month, or are you still just playing Office on your laptop all day?" I kept my expression completely neutral. "I'm doing great, Jamal," I replied calmly. "My projects keep me very busy." He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that actually startled a nearby server. "Busy? Right, hear that, Derek, she's busy." Jamal shook his head in mock sympathy. "Man, I don't know how you do it. Carrying the mortgage, the car payments, and a wife who thinks sending a few emails counts as a career. You're a saint, Derek. If my wife tried that, I would have cut off her credit cards years ago." Derek puffed out his chest, clearly loving the validation. "It's not easy, Jamal. I carry a lot on my shoulders. I just want her to understand how the real corporate world works. That's why I brought her tonight, so when Leo gets here, she can see what real success looks like." Brenda reached over and patted Derek's hand. "You are too good to her, sweetheart. You've always been so kind. She is incredibly lucky you don't charge her rent." I took a sip of my water, enjoying the absolute absurdity of the conversation. Jamal was a mid-level broker at a firm currently drowning in high-risk margin loans. I knew this because my venture capital fund, Apex Horizon, held a massive portion of his company's debt. He was sitting on a financial landmine that I could detonate with a single phone call, yet here he was, bragging about a Rolex. And Derek was playing the exhausted provider while secretly drowning in fraudulent debt he had taken out against my house behind my back. They were two clowns performing in a circus I funded. "I am very lucky," I said, my voice dripping with a cold sweetness they were too arrogant to notice. "It's so entertaining listening to you two discuss high finance, truly educational." Jamal sneered, taking my sarcasm as genuine submission. "Glad you're taking notes, Nora. Maybe you'll learn something. You see, in our world we don't wait for handouts. We take what we want. We run the show." Just then the door to the private room opened again, and the head sommelier walked in, carrying a leather-bound wine list. He nodded politely. "Good evening. While you wait for your final guest, may I suggest some wine?" Before Derek could even reach for it, Jamal snatched the wine list out of the sommelier's hands. "Oh, we are definitely having some drinks tonight," Jamal announced, flipping to the most expensive section at the back. "Since Derek is about to land his little tech contract and become a big shot, I think we need to celebrate properly." Jamal's finger ran down the list of reserve wines. A malicious glint sparked in his eyes as he looked up at me. He wasn't just ordering wine, he was setting a trap. I could see the exact moment the idea to humiliate me further formed in his mind. "We'll take the Chateau Margaux," Jamal told the sommelier, pointing to a bottle. "Make it 2 bottles, we want to make sure everyone has enough." The sommelier bowed. "An excellent choice, sir, I will bring them right away." As the sommelier left the room, Jamal leaned across the table toward me, his gold watch clinking against the glass. "Those run about 2,000 a bottle. Nora, since Derek works so hard to keep a roof over your head, it's only fair you pick up the wine tab tonight. Think of it as your contribution to the household. Or is that little freelance budget of yours too small to handle it?" "My name is Diana. I am 34 years old, and until a few weeks ago, my husband treated me like the punchline of a bad joke." We were sitting in one of the most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurants in Chicago when he leaned in, his hot breath in my ear, warning me not to embarrass him with stories about my pathetic plant shop. He had absolutely no idea that the CEO he was sweating to impress was about to walk through those doors, freeze in his tracks, bow his head, and call me Big Sister. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you are watching this from. And if you've ever had to smile through someone completely disrespecting your true worth, make sure to like and subscribe. The crystal chandeliers of Lasserk cast a warm gold glow over the white tablecloth, but the atmosphere at our table was freezing. I sat quietly in a simple charcoal-wrapped dress, tracing the rim of my water glass. Across from me sat my husband, Bradley, 36, practically vibrating with nervous ambition. He was the VP of Business Development at a major tech firm, and tonight was supposed to be the pinnacle of his career. He was hosting his boss, Mr. Montgomery, desperately trying to lay the groundwork for a massive corporate merger with Apex AI. Then there was my mother-in-law, Patricia, who had crashed the dinner because she never missed an opportunity to drink expensive wine on someone else's dime and pretend she belonged to the Chicago elite. Bradley kept checking his luxury watch, his leg bouncing under the table. The mysterious CEO of Apex AI was 3 hours late. Bradley had ordered plate after plate of premium Wagyu beef, caviar appetizers, and vintage Bordeaux, racking up an absurd bill just to keep Mr. Montgomery from walking out. To fill the painful silence of the wait, Bradley and Patricia did what they always did, used me as their personal punching bag to distract from Bradley's own desperation. Mr. Montgomery took a polite sip of his Cabernet and turned his attention to me, asking how my business was doing. Before I could even open my mouth, Bradley let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Oh, Diana just plays around with dirt and flower pots," Bradley said, waving his hand dismissively as if shooing a fly. "She has this tiny plant shop downtown. It keeps her busy while I handle the real work. I just let her have her little hobby so she doesn't get bored at home while the adults are making the money." Patricia chimed in immediately, leaning across the table with a patronizing smile. "We really are so grateful Bradley is such an amazing provider," she said to Mr. Montgomery, her voice loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. "He practically rescued her. He pays the mortgage, the car payments, handles all the big bills. Not many men would support a wife who contributes so little, but my son has a generous heart." I kept my expression completely neutral, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. They loved this story. For the 5 years of our marriage, Bradley had carefully constructed this illusion that he was my savior. He constantly mocked my simple clothes, my dirt-stained fingernails, and the modest storefront I went to every day. I never bothered to correct him. I never mentioned that my little plant shop was just a quiet sanctuary to escape his massive ego. And I certainly never mentioned that I had bought our entire house in cash before our wedding, or that the mortgage he boasted about paying was actually a secret second loan he had taken out behind my back 3 months ago to fund a lavish lifestyle he couldn't afford. The dinner dragged on painfully. Mr. Montgomery's frustration grew, his eyes constantly darting to his phone as he muttered about the Apex AI team's complete lack of professionalism. Bradley was sweating through his custom suit, scrambling to keep the conversation going. Every time I tried to speak or contribute, Bradley shot me a venomous look or kicked my foot under the table. Finally, Mr. Montgomery wiped his mouth with his linen napkin and threw it on the table. "They clearly aren't coming, Bradley. I've wasted an entire evening here." Right on cue, the waiter discreetly approached, holding a sleek black leather bill presenter. He placed it right in the center of the table. I could clearly see the total printed at the bottom of the receipt. $4,200. Bradley stared at the staggering number, the colour instantly draining from his face. He patted his jacket pockets in a theatrical, exaggerated motion, put on a terrible performance of a man who had suddenly misplaced his wallet. Then a malicious sneer spread across his face, replacing his panic with pure cruelty. He looked straight at me, a vicious challenge shining in his eyes. "Actually, Mr. Montgomery, my beautiful wife insisted on treating us tonight," Bradley announced loudly, sliding the leather presenter across the table until it tapped against my plate. "She wanted to show her appreciation for everything I do. Right, Diana, go ahead, honey. Show Mr. Montgomery how supportive you are." He was intentionally trapping me. He knew the joint card in my wallet had a strict limit, barely enough to cover weekly groceries. It was a limit he had set to control my spending. He wanted my card to decline in front of his boss. He wanted to humiliate me, prove his dominance, and punish me simply for being there while his own career crumbled. I looked down at the leather presenter resting against my plate, then up at my husband. His smile was sickeningly fake. He knew exactly what he was doing. I opened my purse and pulled out the silver plastic card he had so generously given me shortly after our honeymoon. I placed it on the small silver tray and handed it to the waiter. The young man gave a professional nod and turned toward the payment terminal near the busy bar. The silence at our table was suffocating. Mr. Montgomery stared intently at his phone, scrolling, clearly wishing he were anywhere else, but trapped in this uncomfortable family drama. Patricia was practically vibrating with anticipation, sipping her wine, waiting for the explosion she knew her son had carefully orchestrated. It took less than 2 minutes. The waiter returned, his professional mask slipping slightly, a faint flush of awkwardness rising up his neck. He leaned down, placing the presenter back on the table, keeping his voice incredibly low to protect my dignity. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," he murmured, avoiding my eyes. "The card was declined." Bradley let out a loud, dramatic sigh, throwing his hands in the air. The sudden noise made several people at neighboring tables turn their heads. "Declined," he raised his voice, ensuring everyone nearby could hear his manufactured outrage. "Are you serious, Diana? Didn't you tell me you took care of the account this week?" Patricia gasped, clutching the pearls at her neck in theatrical shock. "Oh, Bradley," she sighed loudly, "this is so humiliating for you, and in front of Mr. Montgomery, I can't believe she would put you in this position." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I didn't blush. I didn't stutter. I didn't apologize. I just watched my husband perform his little show. Bradley pulled out his own heavy metal corporate card, tossing it onto the tray, glaring at me with manufactured disgust. "I should have known," he sneered, leaning over the table so his words cut deeper. "I really shouldn't expect someone from your background to handle a real dinner. Diana, you grew up cutting coupons and buying second-hand clothes. You don't understand how the real world works. You simply don't have the class or the financial literacy to sit at this table." Mr. Montgomery shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearing his throat loudly. "Bradley, please just pay the bill so we can leave. This night is over." But Bradley wasn't done. He was riding the high of tearing me down, desperately trying to compensate for the fact that his career-defining meeting had just turned into a massive failure. He needed a scapegoat, and I was the easiest target in the room. "The CEO of Apex AI is a billionaire," Bradley continued, his voice sharp and grating. "If a miracle happens and he actually walks through that door, I can't have you sitting here making us look like we need a handout. Your cheap dress and declined card have already embarrassed me enough tonight. Go wait in the lobby, Diana. Go sit by the coat check and don't talk to anyone. I need to salvage this meeting and your presence is a liability." Patricia smirked, taking another long sip of her vintage Bordeaux. "Run along, dear," she said dismissively, waving a manicured hand toward the front entrance of the restaurant. "Let the men handle the important business. You've done enough damage for one night." I looked at Bradley, at his flushed, angry face, his expensive custom suit, and the absolute certainty in his eyes that he held all the power in our marriage. He truly believed he was the master of my universe. He believed that forcing me to wait by the coat check like a misbehaving child would break my spirit. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I simply picked up my modest clutch and stood up from the table. Something in my unusual calmness seemed to disturb him, a brief flicker of confusion crossing his eyes before his arrogant sneer returned. I smoothed the fabric of my dress and turned away from the table, taking my first step toward the lobby. But before I could take a second step, the atmosphere in the restaurant completely shifted. The murmurs of wealthy diners and the clinking of crystal glasses instantly vanished. The energy in the room plummeted, replaced by a sudden, tight electric tension. The heavy brass and frosted glass double doors of Lasserk were pushed open with authority, sending the maitre d' scrambling backward. 6 men in immaculate dark suits entered the elegant foyer, their earpieces visible, their sharp eyes instantly scanning the dining room. They moved with military precision, parting down the center to create a clear, unobstructed path. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Bradley gasped, practically leaping out of his chair, nearly knocking over his water glass in his scramble to stand at attention. Mr. Montgomery stood up so fast his heavy dining chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. Patricia froze, her wine glass suspended inches from her lips. Through the corridor created by the security team, a young man stepped into the warm light of the restaurant. He wore a tailored midnight blue suit, looking completely relaxed, yet radiating absolute authority without saying a single word. He carried the kind of raw, untouchable power that made seasoned executives sweat. This was the mysterious CEO of Apex AI. The tech visionary Bradley had spent 3 hours waiting to worship. Bradley didn't even wait for the young billionaire to fully step into the room. Desperation completely overrode what little professional etiquette he had left. He shoved past me brutally, his elbow catching my shoulder hard enough to make me stumble. He didn't look back to apologize. He was entirely focused on his target. He smoothed his suit lapels with sweaty palms, his face contorting into a mask of pure corporate sycophancy. "Mr. CEO," Bradley practically shouted, his voice cracking slightly as he rushed across the polished floor. "It is an absolute honor. I am Bradley, Vice President of Business Development. We have been looking forward to this privilege all evening." He thrust his hand forward, desperate to shake the hand of the man who held his entire career trajectory, his bonuses, and his coveted promotion in his hands. Mr. Montgomery was hot on his heels, equally anxious but trying to maintain a shred of dignity. They looked like 2 desperate men begging for a lifeline. Leo didn't slow down. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't even blink. The security team moved with fluid precision, forming a subtle but impenetrable barrier that forced Bradley to stumble backward to avoid a collision. Leo walked straight past Bradley, as if my husband were nothing more than a misplaced chair blocking his path. The complete disregard in that single, continuous motion was devastating. Bradley froze in the center of the restaurant, his hands still hovering in the air, his mouth hanging open in sheer shock. Leo's eyes remained locked on one person, me. A collective breath was held. You could have heard a pin drop in the silent dining room. Patricia clutched the edge of her seat, her eyes darting frantically between her son and the billionaire. Mr. Montgomery stood frozen, holding a glass of freshly poured wine, realizing the most powerful man in the room had completely ignored their eager greeting. Leo stopped less than 2 feet from where I stood, my simple clutch still in my hands. His security detail fanned out instantly, establishing a secure perimeter around us, physically isolating me from Bradley and his toxic family. Leo reached up and slowly took off his dark sunglasses, folding them with precise, deliberate movements. He slid them into his jacket's breast pocket. Then, in front of the elite of Chicago, in front of the boss who held my husband's future, in front of the mother-in-law who had just spent 2 hours mocking my existence, this untouchable tech visionary bowed his head. It wasn't a casual, polite nod. It was a deep bow of absolute respect and loyalty. "Big sister," Leo said. His voice was calm, clear, and carried perfectly across the dead silent room. "Are these people bothering you?" The sound of shattering glass pierced the heavy silence like a gunshot. Mr. Montgomery had actually dropped his wine glass. The delicate crystal smashed against the floor, splashing deep red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth and onto his expensive leather shoes. He didn't even notice the stain. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated horror. His frantic, terrified gaze darted between his ambitious vice president and the woman they had just treated like trash. Mr. Montgomery realized, in that single second, that his subordinate had just publicly humiliated the beloved older sister of the man they were desperately begging to save their company. Patricia looked as though the oxygen had been vacuumed from her lungs. Her jaw opened and closed silently. The smug, venomous satisfaction that had been plastered on her face all evening was completely gone, erased and replaced by a pale, sickly terror. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, staring at me as if seeing me for the very first time. And Bradley was a portrait of complete psychological collapse. His brain simply could not process the data in front of him. The man he idolized, the billionaire he needed to please for his promotion, was treating his apparently useless, coupon-cutting wife with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty. Bradley slowly turned his head to face me, all the color completely drained from his face. He looked like a ghost. His eyes were wide, silently begging for this to be an illusion, a mistake, a horrific joke. I didn't rush to comfort him. I didn't shrink back or play the submissive, embarrassed wife he had demanded I be just moments ago. I stood tall, feeling the undeniable electric surge of power running through my veins. All those years of biting my tongue, of quietly enduring his disrespect, of intentionally making myself small so he could feel big, dissolved in that single, glorious moment. I turned slowly, letting the heavy silence stretch, letting them all soak in their sudden, suffocating panic. I looked Bradley up and down slowly, letting my gaze linger on his sweating forehead, his trembling hands, and his completely shattered ego. I offered him a smile. It wasn't a warm smile. It was sharp, cold, and absolutely terrifying. I was just about to leave, I said, my voice ringing out clearly in the quiet restaurant, but the CEO you spent 3 hours waiting for just asked me to stay. Leo looked from me to the leather bill presenter sitting like a live grenade on the white tablecloth. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. One look at Bradley's terrified, sweating face and the declined plastic card on the silver tray told him everything. Leo snapped his fingers. The gesture was sharp and absolute. The restaurant manager, who had been hovering nervously near the bar, practically sprinted over, his hands clasped together in eager submission. "Yes, sir, what can I do for you?" the manager asked, bowing slightly. "Take that bill," Leo commanded, pointing to the presenter Bradley had tried to use as a weapon against me just minutes prior. "Charge it, and the entire dining room's expenses for the rest of the evening, to the Vanguard Holdings corporate account. Authorization code Delta 9er. The manager's eyes widened to the size of saucers. "Right away, sir. Thank you, sir." Bradley finally found his voice. It was a hoarse, high-pitched, pathetic sound, stripped of the last remnants of the masculine dominance he had been throwing around all evening. He stumbled forward a step, hands raised in a frantic, placating gesture. "Wait, hold on," Bradley stammered, his eyes darting wildly between Leo and the manager. "Sir, there has to be a massive misunderstanding here. Vanguard Holdings, that's a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. Diana doesn't work for them, she's just a florist. She plays with dirt. She runs a tiny plant shop on 4th Street. You have her confused with someone else. She's my wife, I pay for her, I support her." Patricia nodded frantically beside him, her pearl necklace clacking against her collarbone as she shook. "Yes, exactly, she's just a normal girl. My son handles all the finances. He's a vice president." Leo stared at Bradley. The silence that followed was heavy with absolute contempt. Then Leo laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that bounced off the crystal chandeliers, sending a shiver straight down Bradley's spine. Leo snapped his fingers again. His chief assistant stepped forward from the wall of security, opening a sleek black briefcase and pulling out a thick, leather-bound folder. Leo took the folder and dropped it onto the table, right on top of my declined credit card. "A florist," Leo repeated, the amusement vanishing from his face, replaced by a deadly coldness. "You arrogant, blind fool. This woman you call a florist sold her first global logistics company 5 years ago for a 9-figure sum. She took that massive influx of capital and became the sole angel investor for my entire AI empire. Apex AI exists because she funded it from the ground up. I am the CEO, yes, but she is the founder and chairwoman of Vanguard Holdings. She owns me. She owns the building you work in. And as of this morning, she is the majority shareholder holding the strings to the corporate merger your boss is begging us to sign." The blood completely left Bradley's face. His knees literally gave out, and he collapsed back into his dining chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Mr. Montgomery gripped the edge of the table, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. Patricia covered her mouth with both hands, choking back a sob of pure terror. The truth hit Bradley with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. For the past 5 years, he had been mocking, belittling, and financially abusing a woman who had the power to destroy his entire corporate existence with a single phone call. Desperation took hold of him. Bradley scrambled out of his chair and fell to his knees, completely ignoring the security guards who tensed up, ready to drop him. He knelt there on the polished hardwood floor, reaching out with trembling, sweaty hands, trying to grab the hem of my simple charcoal wrap dress. "Diana, please," Bradley begged, tears of absolute panic streaming down his face, completely abandoning his former pride. "Please, honey, you have to help me, you have to talk to him. Mr. Montgomery needs this merger to go through. My promotion depends on it, my entire bonus depends on it. We're a team, we're married, just tell Leo to sign the papers. Please, Diana, save my career, I'll do anything." I looked down at the man who had tormented me for years. I looked at the man who had tried to break my spirit just to pump up his own pathetic ego. The man who had just tried to humiliate me in front of Chicago's elite. I didn't feel a single shred of pity. I leaned down slowly, peeling his sweaty, desperate fingers off my dress, one by one. I leaned in close, letting the scent of my expensive, understated perfume wash over him, and whispered directly into his ear. "You said earlier that this table was reserved for important people. Now you can leave." I stood up, turned my back on him, and slipped my arm through Leo's. As we turned to head toward the private VIP dining room at the back of the restaurant, Mr. Montgomery finally lost it. The senior executive slammed his fist onto the table, completely ignoring the shattering plates and splashing red wine. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Bradley, who was still kneeling on the floor, utterly humiliated. "You absolute idiot," Mr. Montgomery roared, his voice echoing through the entire luxury restaurant, drawing the eyes of every wealthy diner in the building. "Fix this mess by tomorrow morning, Bradley. You get on your knees and beg for her forgiveness or you are fired. Do you hear me? Fired." The next morning I stood in my kitchen, watching the espresso machine drip rich, dark coffee into my favorite ceramic mug. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, lighting up the spotless white marble countertops. It was a beautiful, crisp Chicago morning. The sheer tranquility of the house was a sharp contrast to the total meltdown that had taken place just 12 hours ago. Around 3 in the morning, Bradley had slunk through the front door smelling of stale whiskey and panic, locking himself in the guest bedroom without saying a word. I, on the other hand, had slept peacefully. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter, roasted aroma, when the heavy oak front door was suddenly thrown open. The massive crash echoed through the foyer. I didn't flinch. I knew exactly who had the door code and the sheer audacity to barge in unannounced. The aggressive click-clack of high heels on the hardwood floor was followed by the heavy, dragging footsteps of someone who had never done a day of real work in his life. Patricia marched into the kitchen, her face tight with a mix of leftover humiliation and aggressive entitlement. Right behind her was Spencer, Bradley's 28-year-old, chronically unemployed younger brother, wearing a designer tracksuit I knew Bradley had paid for. He radiated a cheap but heavy scent of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance. Bradley followed them, looking like a whipped dog. His eyes were bloodshot and his shoulders slumped. He hid behind his mother, relying on her to fix the catastrophic mess of his professional life. I had expected to see begging. I thought Bradley would drop to his knees just like Mr. Montgomery had ordered, but Patricia was a master of delusion. She slammed her expensive leather bag onto my clean kitchen island. "Diana, we need to have a serious talk," Patricia ordered, her voice sharp and dominant, as if last night had never happened. "You hid a massive secret from this family. Letting my son believe you were struggling while you hoarded billions of dollars is practically financial abuse. We were completely left in the dark, but we are a forgiving family. If you make this right today, we are willing to overlook your deception." I took another sip of my coffee, raising an eyebrow. "Make this right," I repeated, my voice devoid of emotion. Spencer scoffed, crossing his arms as he leaned against the refrigerator. "Yeah, Diana, you owe us. Since your secret billionaire brother is the big boss at Apex AI, you're going to call him right now. Tell him I'm taking over as director of operations at his headquarters. I'll need a corner office, a full corporate benefits package, and a starting salary of at least $400,000. I'll also need a hefty signing bonus. My gaming streams aren't exactly paying the bills, and it's time you actually helped your family." Patricia nodded eagerly, validating her youngest son's ridiculous delusion. "Exactly. Spencer deserves an executive role. He has so much talent. As for Bradley, you are going to call Mr. Montgomery immediately. You will tell him that Vanguard Holdings guarantees the merger, but only on the condition that Bradley is promoted to senior vice president. Furthermore, you will arrange for Bradley to receive a massive chunk of free equity in this new venture. It's the least you can do after publicly humiliating him in front of his boss. You owe your husband that financial security. I set my coffee cup down. The sheer audacity of these people was almost clinical. They had spent years stepping on my neck, mocking my background and treating me like unpaid help. Yet the moment they realized I owned the ground they stood on, they demanded I carry them. "Have you all completely lost your minds?" I asked calmly. "Your son mocked me, tried to publicly humiliate me, and nearly ruined his own company because of his fragile ego. You sat there and watched him try to trap me with a bill he knew I couldn't pay, laughing the entire time. And now you walk into my home demanding executive titles and free equity." Patricia's face flushed a dangerous shade of purple. Her hand slammed onto the marble countertop. "How dare you speak to me in that tone in the house I provided for you?" Patricia shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly in my face. "You ungrateful little brat. I bought this house for you too. I secured the down payment. I raised you from a broke florist to a respectable suburban housewife. You would have absolutely nothing without the foundation this family gave you. I pulled you out of the gutter. You owe this family everything." I stared at her, letting her desperate, screaming lies echo in the quiet kitchen. Bradley kept his eyes glued to the floor, absolutely refusing to make eye contact with me. He knew the truth, but his mother's gaslighting had always been his favorite shield. I turned away from them. I walked straight past the pantry to a large, framed botanical print on the wall. I pulled the heavy wooden frame open, revealing a digital keypad flush with the drywall. I typed in a 6-digit code. The heavy steel door of the hidden wall safe clicked open. Bradley let out a confused, choked gasp. He had lived in this house for 5 years and never knew the safe existed. I reached inside and pulled out a thick legal manila folder. Walking back to the kitchen island, I slapped the original notarized property deed right next to Patricia's designer purse. "I bought this house in cash in full before the wedding," I stated, my voice dropping to a deadly, icy whisper. "The original deed has only my name on it. I let Patricia pretend she helped because Bradley begged me to protect his fragile ego. But tell me, Bradley, did you tell them about the secret second mortgage you took out on this house behind my back 3 months ago?" The truth hit Patricia like a physical blow. Her jaw dropped, her perfectly lipsticked mouth forming a stiff, shocked circle. She whipped her head around to face her golden boy, her eyes wide with frantic, desperate denial. The entire foundation of her pride, the lies she told at the country club about her wealthy son buying a mansion for his poor wife, was a complete fabrication. Bradley hadn't rescued me. He was drowning, and he had been using my assets as a life raft just to keep his head above water. "A second mortgage?" Patricia gasped, the air leaving her lungs. "Bradley, tell me she's lying. Tell me you didn't forge documents to borrow money against a house you don't even own." Bradley backed away from the kitchen island, his hands gesturing wildly, shaking in the air. He looked like a cornered animal looking for an escape. "Mom, listen to me," he stammered, heavy sweat beads forming on his forehead. "It was just a temporary cash flow issue, a short-term bridge loan. I made some aggressive investments that went sideways, but I was going to pay it back the second the Apex AI merger went through and my executive bonus cleared." Spencer threw his hands in the air, his face twisting with sudden, vicious rage. "Wait, so you're broke?" Spencer shouted, his entitlement instantly turning to anger. "You promised to fund my gaming channel equipment next month. You promised me $50,000 for gear and marketing. You said you had endless capital coming in." Bradley turned on his brother, his panic turning into desperate cruelty. "Grow up, Spencer. I've been drowning in debt trying to keep up with Mom's ridiculous social circles and fund your lazy, jobless lifestyle. I don't have a dime to give you. I am completely tapped out." Patricia clutched her chest, hyperventilating as her reality shattered. Her VP son, the man she claimed rescued me from the gutter, was a fraud, but her toxic pride wouldn't allow her to blame him. She whipped around to face me, her eyes flashing with desperate malice. "You drove him to this," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You hid your wealth from him. You forced him to take out loans to maintain his status because you were too selfish to support your own husband. This is all your fault." Before I could even respond to her pathetic attempt at gaslighting, the heavy oak front door opened once more. Firm, confident footsteps echoed down the hallway. moving with a deliberate, calm rhythm that stood in stark contrast to Patricia's frantic packing and Spencer's lazy shuffle. Jamal walked into the kitchen. At 35, he was tall, athletic, and wore an immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal suit that made Bradley's expensive but wrinkled clothes look entirely cheap. As the husband of Bradley's sister, Megan, Jamal had spent the last 7 years enduring the relentless, thinly veiled racism and classist microaggressions of this insufferable family. Despite holding a master's degree in cybersecurity from MIT, Patricia treated him like the family handyman, asking him to fix the Wi-Fi router or set up a printer at every Thanksgiving dinner. Bradley always introduced him to his corporate friends as Megan's husband who works in it, intentionally minimizing his career to make himself feel superior. For years, Jamal had quietly tolerated their blatant disrespect, knowing full well that his intellect, character, and net worth far exceeded theirs. Patricia immediately turned her frantic panic onto the newcomer, desperate to reclaim a sense of dominance over someone she viewed as beneath her. "What are you doing here?" she shrieked, her face twisting with ugly, bare contempt. "This is a private family crisis. Who let you in? We don't need you hovering around listening to our financial business. Get out of my son's house right now, or I'm calling the police for trespassing." Jamal didn't flinch. He didn't slow his pace. He didn't even look at Patricia. He walked right past her, treating her with the same absolute, ignoring silence Leo had used on Bradley the night before. He bypassed Spencer, who instinctively shrank back from Jamal's commanding, indifferent presence, and walked straight to me at the kitchen island. "Good morning, Diana," Jamal said, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the chaotic, high-pitched shrieks of my in-laws. "Megan sends her love. She decided to stay in the car. She said she couldn't stand the sight of her mother's or her brother's face today." I offered Jamal a genuine, relaxed smile, the first warm expression I had shown all morning. In this toxic family, Jamal had always been the only person to treat me with real respect. We had bonded over being the quiet outsiders, sitting in corners and observing the absolute absurdity of people who genuinely thought they were superior to us. Bradley lunged forward, his face flushed red with panic and rage, pointing an aggressive, shaking finger at Jamal. "You don't belong here, Jamal. You work in my company's IT department. I am a vice president. I will have you fired by noon for trespassing on my property and harassing my family." Jamal finally turned his head, locking his calm, lethal gaze onto my husband. "First of all, Bradley, I don't work in your IT department. I am an independent, elite cybersecurity auditor hired directly by your board of directors to monitor corporate compliance. I report to the chairman, not middle management. Second, you don't own this property. We all just heard Diana prove that." Bradley swallowed hard, the remaining color leaving his face as the reality of Jamal's actual position finally registered in his panicked brain. Jamal turned his attention back to me, his expression turning incredibly serious. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. Patricia was still babbling in the background, demanding respect and calling for security, but her voice faded into meaningless background noise, eclipsed by the heavy, impending reality of what Jamal was about to do. He had spent the last 48 hours pulling consecutive all-nighters, using his high-level security clearances and forensic accounting software to dig deep into Bradley's company's encrypted servers. He had bypassed firewalls and traced hidden digital footprints Bradley assumed were permanently deleted. Jamal pulled his hand from his pocket. Pinched between his fingers was a sleek, heavy, matte black USB drive. The small metal device glinted under the kitchen's bright, recessed lights. He dropped it onto the marble kitchen island. It landed with a sharp, decisive click right next to the original property deed and Patricia's designer purse. The sound made Bradley flinch, as if a gun had gone off in the room. "Diana," Jamal said, his voice echoing with devastating clarity, "I audited Bradley's corporate accounts and his personal accounts. I'm sorry it took me this long to bring you the proof." I picked up the matte black USB drive. It felt incredibly heavy, loaded with the digital execution of my husband's entire existence. Bradley lunged, his hands clawing wildly across the marble island to grab the device from my hand. He didn't get halfway. Jamal stepped smoothly in front of him, planting his feet and crossing his arms. Jamal was a weekend marathon runner. Bradley's weekends consisted of whiskey and golf. When Bradley hit Jamal's chest, he bounced off like a paperweight hitting a brick wall. "Get out of my way," Bradley shrieked, his voice cracking with pure terror. "That is stolen company property. You'll go to federal prison for this, Jamal. I'll press charges." Jamal looked down at him without expression. "I am a federally licensed auditor, Bradley. I have full authorization to pull these files. The only person facing federal charges today is you." I turned, ignoring the pathetic struggle, and walked out of the kitchen with measured, rhythmic steps toward our spacious living room. The massive 85-inch smart TV dominated the far wall. Patricia and Spencer stumbled in after me, their previous anger completely overshadowed by a morbid, greedy curiosity. They still believed Bradley was a financial genius who had just made a minor mistake. They wanted to see the numbers. They wanted to know how much wealth they could still drain from him once the dust settled. I plugged the USB drive directly into the port on the side of the TV screen. I grabbed the remote and switched the input to the external device. The screen flashed black for a fraction of a second before mirroring the drive's contents. The resolution was crystal clear. Dozens of meticulously organized folders popped up on the screen. Jamal had categorized everything with cold efficiency. I clicked on the folder labeled Hidden Liabilities and Offshore Transfers. A massive spreadsheet opened, filled with highlighted rows of wire transfers routed through shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Delaware LLCs. Patricia stepped forward, squinting at the screen. "What is all this?" she demanded. "These are just business expenses. My son manages high-level corporate assets." "These are not corporate assets," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet living room. "Look at the funding accounts, Patricia." I highlighted a specific column. The routing numbers matched our joint savings account, the one where I had deposited my modest earnings to maintain my cover, while Bradley claimed he was depositing our savings for our future. "For over 2 years, he has been systematically draining funds from our joint assets," I explained, keeping my tone completely clinical. "He routed the money through shell companies to hide it from me and the IRS. He is in millions of dollars of hidden debt, taking out loans from predatory lenders to cover his losses from bad stock investments that tanked." Bradley was hyperventilating in the hallway, trying to push past Jamal, completely unable to budge the larger man. "Turn it off," Bradley begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic whimper. "Diana, please turn it off. We can settle this privately. Don't do this in front of them." I ignored him entirely. I backed out of the spreadsheet and opened the next folder, simply labeled Real Estate Assets. A high-resolution scan of a property deed appeared on the massive screen. It detailed a penthouse apartment in one of the most exclusive, expensive high-rises in downtown Chicago. Patricia gasped, her hands flying together. Her face instantly shifted from panic to pure, unfiltered greed. "Oh, Bradley, you brilliant boy," she exclaimed, pointing smugly at the screen. "I knew it. You were making secret real estate investments. You bought a luxury condo downtown to flip for a profit. Do you see, Diana? He is a financial genius. He's building a real portfolio while you grow daisies." I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. It was the first time I had laughed all morning, and the sound made Patricia flinch. "You are incredibly blind, Patricia," I said, turning to look her straight in the eyes. "Read the second name on the deed, right under your brilliant son's." Spencer moved closer to the screen, his eyes scanning the legal document. He squinted at the fine print. "Who is Vanessa?" Spencer asked, completely unaware of the bomb he was about to detonate. Bradley let out a wounded, choking sound from the hallway. "Vanessa is not a real estate partner," I stated, keeping my eyes locked on Bradley. "Vanessa is a 24-year-old fitness instructor. She is his mistress." Patricia froze, her hands suspended in the air, pointing at the screen, her mouth wide open in sheer shock. I clicked on a subfolder containing bank statements and credit card receipts. The screen filled with undeniable proof. For 2 years, Bradley has been funding a fully paid, lavish lifestyle for his mistress. He paid her rent, bought her a sports car, and took her on luxury vacations to the Bahamas using money stolen from our joint accounts, all while telling me he was on corporate retreats. That condo isn't an investment property. It's a fully funded love nest. He drained his home equity, took out a secret second mortgage on this house, and committed corporate fraud, all to impress a girl 12 years younger than him. The silence in the living room was deafening. Patricia looked physically sick. Her perfect, successful VP son was not only broke, He was a lying, cheating, embezzling fraud who had squandered their family reputation for a secret double life. Bradley finally snapped. The sheer terror of having his carefully constructed, arrogant facade completely demolished sent him into a wild, desperate panic. He ducked under Jamal's arm and scrambled into the living room, clawing his way across the floor. He didn't care about his custom suit or his dignity. He rushed toward the TV, his hands reaching out, desperately trying to yank the USB drive from the port to destroy the evidence. "You can't do this to me," Bradley screamed, his voice tearing at his throat. "I won't let you ruin my life." He lunged at the screen, his fingers scratching frantically at the side panel to find the small metal drive. But in his blind panic, his hand slammed hard against the TV bezel, knocking the remote control off the media console. It hit the floor, and the impact accidentally pressed the play button. Bradley grabbed the USB drive, ripping it out with a violent tug. He stood there panting, clutching the device to his chest. A wild, triumphant grin spread across his sweaty face, but the damage was already done. The media player on the smart TV had already buffered the next file in the queue. As Bradley stood there clutching the disconnected drive, the massive surround sound speakers in our living room crackled to life. An audio file began to play automatically, broadcasting at maximum volume. It was a recorded phone call. The audio was crystal clear, intercepted directly from Bradley's corporate phone data cache by Jamal's expert auditing software. Bradley's voice filled the room, sounding relaxed, arrogant, and incredibly cruel. He was speaking to his mistress, Vanessa. "I know, baby, I know," the recorded version of Bradley laughed. "I'll be over to the condo as soon as I can. I just have to deal with my mother first. She's always begging for money. Honestly, she's just a greedy old leech who treats my bank account like her personal lottery. I'm so tired of pretending to respect her." Patricia let out a horrible, strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. The color completely drained from her face. "And my brother is even worse," the recorded Bradley continued, his voice dripping with pure disgust. "Spencer is a completely useless parasite. He just sits around in expensive tracksuits pretending to be an influencer while draining my wallet. As soon as this merger goes through and I get my executive bonus, I'm cutting both of them off for good. They are pathetic dependents and I'm tired of carrying them." The echo of the recording faded into a suffocating, heavy silence. Bradley stood frozen in front of the TV. The disconnected USB drive slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering onto the floor. The sharp sound of metal hitting hardwood seemed to break the spell holding the room hostage. Patricia took a slow, shaking step forward. Her perfect suburban matriarch facade was entirely shattered, leaving a hollow, broken older woman. The son she idolized, the man she bragged about to everyone at the country club, had just called her a greedy leech. She raised her hand, her diamond rings catching the ambient light, and slapped Bradley across the face with everything she had. The slap sounded like a whip cracking through the spacious living room. Bradley stumbled back, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and fear. "How dare you, Bradley?" Patricia hissed, her voice trembling with a venom I had never heard her use before. "I gave you everything. I protected you. I bragged about you to everyone we know, and you call me a parasite while squandering millions on some fitness instructor." Before Bradley could even formulate a pathetic excuse, Spencer lunged. The insult about him being a useless parasite had pierced his fragile, untalented ego. Spencer tackled his brother at the waist, driving his shoulder straight into Bradley's chest. Both grown men crashed backward, smashing through my custom glass coffee table, sending the top shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. It was a pathetic, chaotic brawl. Designer suits were ripped and fists flew wildly. Spencer swung chaotic punches, screaming about his ruined gaming career and the money Bradley owed him. Bradley fought back with frantic, desperate shoves, trying to protect his face while slipping on the polished wood floor. Bradley's lips split, smearing blood across his white shirt collar. They were no longer the arrogant, untouchable men of this family. They were wild animals tearing at the scraps of each other's ruined pride. I didn't move, I just watched the empire of lies burn itself to ash. Jamal stepped smoothly in front of me, his broad shoulders shielding me from flying glass and wild limbs. He didn't raise a fist. He didn't have to. He possessed an innate, commanding authority that required zero physical violence. "Enough," Jamal's voice boomed through the room. It wasn't a shout. It was a command delivered with the absolute weight of a man who was completely out of patience. Both brothers froze, panting and tangled in the broken furniture. Patricia sobbed into her hands, her styled hair falling messily over her tear-stained face. Jamal looked down at the three of them with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You people are unbelievable," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal cadence. "For 7 years I've sat at family dinners with you. I've watched you look down on my skin color, my background, and my supposed IT job. You treated Diana like a peasant because she preferred dirt to your fake designer bags. You built this pathetic suburban illusion on the idea that you were genetically and financially superior to everyone else." Jamal stepped closer to Patricia, who shrank back in fear. "And now look at you," he continued, his tone ruthless. "You are nothing but hypocrites. Patricia, you worship a son who actively stole from his own marriage to fund a mistress. Spencer, you demand executive pay with 0 skills, expecting the world to hand you a crown just for existing. And you, Bradley." Jamal turned his gaze to my bleeding, panting husband. "You are the biggest fraud of them all. You embezzled from your company. You stole from your wife. You sold out your own blood just to feel like a big man in a downtown condo. The only real people in this room are the ones you thought were beneath you." I stepped out from behind Jamal, feeling a deep, absolute sense of relief. My perfectly decorated living room was ruined, but I had never felt so clean. I looked down at Bradley, who was trying to wipe the blood from his mouth with his torn suit sleeve. "Get out," I said. My voice was completely calm, devoid of anger or sadness, only finality. Bradley blinked up at me, spitting blood onto the ruined floor. "Diana, please," he croaked. "I said get out," I repeated, taking a step closer. "All of you get out of my house. Patricia, take your golden boy and your parasite younger son and leave my property. You have exactly 5 minutes, or I trigger the panic alarm and have the police remove you for trespassing and vandalism." Patricia scrambled to her feet, grabbing her designer bag with trembling hands. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Bradley. She practically ran for the front door, abandoning her precious sons to preserve what little face she had left. Spencer scrambled up right behind her, clutching a blackening eye, abandoning his brother without a second thought. The heavy front door slammed shut behind them. Bradley remained on the floor. He slowly pushed himself up, his body swaying slightly as the reality of his situation set in. His mother had abandoned him. His brother hated him. His career was imploding and his secret life was fully exposed. He was cornered, a desperate rat with nowhere left to run. And like a rat, he bared his teeth. The pathetic, pleading look on Bradley's face vanished. His eyes turned dark, wild, and consumed by a frightening, unhinged greed. He wiped the blood from his chin, staining his hand, and let out a broken, manic laugh. "Fine," Bradley screamed, his voice tearing at his throat. "Fine, I'll go. You think you won, Diana. You think you can just kick me out and go back to your billionaire brother and your massive venture capital firm like nothing happened. You're forgetting one key detail." He took a stumbling step closer to me, his chest heaving, his face twisting into a mask of pure, vengeful malice. "This is a 50-50 state," Bradley roared, pointing a blood-stained finger directly in my face. "We are married. I don't care how many secret businesses you started or how much capital you pumped into Apex AI. What's yours is mine. I'm calling the most ruthless divorce lawyer in this city. I'm taking half of your secret Vanguard Holdings wealth in the divorce. I'm taking half of your billions, Diana. You are going to spend the rest of your life paying me back." Bradley stood amidst the shattered glass of our living room, his chest heaving as his threats echoed off the walls. He didn't back down. He didn't run to pack his bags. Instead, fueled by the intoxicating delusion of unearned millions, he pulled his phone from his ruined suit pocket. His hands shook, smearing blood across the screen, but his eyes were locked on me with a manic, greedy intensity. He paced the floor, barking orders into the receiver, demanding his lawyer drop everything and get to the house immediately. He wanted to strike while the iron was hot, absolutely convinced he had just discovered the ultimate winning lottery ticket. Jamal stepped forward, offering to throw him out physically, but I raised my hand, stopping him. "Let him stay," I said evenly. "Let him call his attack dogs. I want to watch this play out." It took less than 40 minutes for Bradley's legal muscle to arrive. A sleek silver sports car pulled aggressively into my driveway, its tires chirping against the pavement. The man who stepped out was the absolute definition of predatory corporate law. He wore a pinstripe suit that cost more than my first car, and carried an initialed leather briefcase. He walked into my home without even knocking, surveying the blood, the broken coffee table, and the general chaos of the room with an amused, cynical smirk. This was Preston Cole, a notorious divorce attorney in the city, famous for stripping spouses bare and leaving them with nothing but legal bills and regret. It was clear Bradley had already retained him months ago, likely preparing to divorce me and leave me penniless the moment his corporate merger with Apex AI went through. Now, the expensive weapon he had bought to destroy my life was being repurposed to steal my empire. Preston stepped carefully over the broken glass, standing beside my husband. He didn't introduce himself to me. He didn't acknowledge Jamal, who stood to the side, quietly observing the scene. Preston simply popped open his briefcase, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and looked at me as if I were a highly profitable piece of meat. "Well, Diana," Preston began, his voice dripping with heavy condescension, "my client has just informed me of a rather fascinating development. It seems that throughout the duration of this marriage, you have been operating in extreme bad faith, concealing massive sources of income, running shell companies, and hiding a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm from your legal spouse. That is the textbook definition of financial deception." Bradley stood tall, a triumphant sneer stretching across his bruised face. He dabbed his bleeding chin with a handkerchief, clearly emboldened by his lawyer's aggressive presence. "Tell her exactly how this works, Preston. Tell her what she owes me." Preston chuckled, taking a slow, measured lap around my wrecked living room. "The law in this state is beautifully straightforward, Diana. Marital assets are marital assets, regardless of whose name is on the holding company. You thought you were incredibly clever, playing the submissive, quiet plant shop owner while building a shadow empire behind my client's back. But the reality is, every dollar you made, every share you acquired, and every investment you made during the marriage belongs equally to Bradley." He paused, letting the threat sink in, clearly expecting me to break down in tears. When I didn't react, he pressed harder, his tone turning predatory. "We will subpoena every single record owned by Vanguard Holdings. We will audit your brother's company, Apex AI, to establish the exact valuation of your initial seed funding. We will drag your entire hidden financial network into the glaring spotlight of public court. By the time I am done dismantling your corporate structure, Bradley will own half of your shares, half of your voting rights, and half of your liquid capital. You will also be paying him millions of dollars a year in alimony, just to maintain his standard of living." Bradley laughed out loud, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Do you hear that? I'm taking your brother's company right out from under you. You ruined my career tonight, so I'm taking yours. I'll be sitting on your board of directors by next month." I didn't yell, I didn't argue the law with him. I simply turned my back on the two gloating men and walked into the kitchen. I walked over to the espresso machine. The loud grind of the coffee beans completely drowned out Preston's droning monologue about asset division and forensic accounting. I frothed the milk, carefully pouring it into my mug. Jamal leaned against the kitchen counter, watching me with a quiet, knowing smile. He knew that I never enter a fight unless I've already won it. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The rich, warm flavor was an absolute luxury. I walked back into the living room holding my mug, radiating an aura of absolute, unbothered peace. Preston frowned, clearly annoyed that his aggressive intimidation tactics were bouncing off me like rain on titanium. "Are you even listening to me?" he snapped, his professional mask starting to crack. "You are facing absolute financial ruin. You are about to lose half of $1 billion empire. You should be calling your own legal counsel to negotiate a settlement, or I will freeze every account associated with your name." I took another sip of my coffee, enjoying the silence that followed his outburst. I walked past Preston. I walked past Bradley. I walked straight to the hallway to the botanical print hiding my wall safe. I punched in the 6-digit code. The heavy steel door clicked open. Preston watched me with crossed arms. "Running to your safe isn't going to help you hide anything, Diana. My forensic team will find every document, every gold bar, and every offshore routing number you possess." I ignored him. I reached past the stacks of property deeds and corporate seals. From the very bottom of the safe, I pulled out a single, faded manila folder. It wasn't a thick document. It was just a few pages of heavy bond paper, signed and notarized half a decade ago. I walked back into the living room, tossing the manila folder onto the only undamaged side table left in the space. Before we discuss my assets, I said, my voice cutting through the room with surgical precision, let's discuss the contract Bradley forced me to sign 5 years ago. Bradley scoffed, his bruised face twisting into a mask of pure, frantic confusion. Contract? What contract? He glared at Preston, silently demanding his expensive attack dog do his job and vaporize this new obstacle. Preston didn't answer immediately. He approached the undamaged side table with the extreme caution of a bomb disposal expert. He flipped open the faded manila cover. The crisp, dense legal text inside was unmistakable. It was a prenuptial agreement, bound in heavy blue backing paper, and stamped with the seal of a prominent local notary. I walked slowly around the shattered glass coffee table, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood. 5 years ago, I explained, keeping my eyes locked on my husband, Bradley had just been promoted to regional manager. He had just received a tiny bump in salary and a modest stock option package. He was absolutely terrified that his newly acquired wealth would be drained by a woman who played in the dirt all day. He told his mother I was a financial liability. He thought I was going to be a drag on him, stealing his hard-earned corporate bonuses. Bradley's eyes darted around the room. I didn't force you to sign that. My mother suggested it. It was just a standard precaution to protect my retirement accounts and company stock options. It was a perfectly drafted execution order, I corrected him. You hired an aggressive legal team to construct it. You wanted to make sure that in the event our marriage collapsed, I could never touch a single dime of yours. Preston was reading the document in silence, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs with increasing speed. His cynical smirk was completely gone, his jaw clenched and a crease formed on his forehead. Read it out loud, Preston, I commanded. Read the parameters of the asset division so your client knows exactly where he stands. The ruthless divorce attorney cleared his throat. For the first time since he had swaggered through my front door, his professional detachment wavered. Section 4, paragraph 2, Preston read, his voice flat and mechanical. All assets acquired, developed, founded, or funded by either party during the course of the marriage shall remain the sole and exclusive property of the acquiring party. Corporate equity, venture capital, or real estate assets shall not be commingled. What is mine is mine. What is yours is yours. Bradley swallowed hard, the remaining colour completely draining from his face, leaving him looking sickly. Wait, that can't apply to a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. That was just to protect my personal savings and company stock options. You can't use a standard prenup to hide an entire financial empire. Preston didn't look up from the page. Actually, Bradley, he said, his tone turning incredibly cold. The language your lawyers used is ironclad. It covers all corporate equity and venture capital with 0 exceptions. She doesn't owe you half of Vanguard Holdings. She doesn't owe you a single dime of her business income. By forcing her to sign this, you legally sealed yourself off from her entire fortune. You built a fortress to keep her out and locked yourself out of it in the process. Bradley stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting the wall. He ran his hands through his hair, leaving streaks of dried blood on his forehead. No, he gasped, his chest heaving with panic. No, that contract is 5 years old. A judge can throw it out. We can fight it in court. We can say I was under duress or that the financial disparity is too great to enforce. You can certainly try to litigate it, I said calmly, taking a sip of my coffee. But you forgot the most important part of that document, Bradley. The part you insisted on adding because you wanted to maintain absolute control over me. You were so convinced I was going to cheat on you with a landscaper that you demanded a penalty clause. I pointed to the final pages of the contract resting in Preston's hands. Turn to Section 9, Preston, the moral turpitude clause. Preston flipped the page. He read the heading and his shoulders visibly slumped. He let out a long, heavy sigh, the sound of a man who had just realized he had wasted an expensive trip across the city for nothing. Section 9, Preston read, skipping past the legal jargon straight to the lethal blow. In the event that a divorce is initiated due to proven marital infidelity, adultery, or the diversion of marital funds to maintain an extramarital affair, the offending party shall forfeit any right to challenge this agreement. The offending party waives all claims to alimony, spousal support, and legal fee reimbursement. They shall leave the marriage with absolutely no claim to any assets. The silence draped over the living room was absolute. Jamal, who had been quietly leaning against the kitchen counter, let out a low, appreciative whistle. You dug your own grave, man, Jamal said. shaking his head in pure disbelief. You bought the shovel, paid for the dirt, and then jumped right in. Bradley looked completely shattered. He turned his desperate, wide eyes to the massive smart TV screen. The spreadsheet detailing his offshore transfers to his mistress was still brightly lit. In the next window, the high-resolution scan of the downtown luxury penthouse deed, showing the name of the 24-year-old fitness instructor, remained open. The audio recording of him viciously mocking his mother and brother while planning his next getaway was still fresh in everyone's minds. The evidence wasn't circumstantial. It was forensic-grade, undeniable, and currently sitting right there in that sleek black USB drive on the floor. Preston slowly closed the manila folder. He didn't toss it back onto the table. He laid it down with extreme care, as if the document were radioactive. He looked at the prenuptial agreement, then up at the TV screen showing irrefutable proof of Bradley's 2-year affair, and finally at his client. "Bradley," Preston said, his voice stripped of the aggressive, predatory arrogance he had walked in with. "You told me on the phone that your wife was concealing assets and that you were the primary provider. You failed to mention that you forced her to sign an ironclad prenup that completely seals off her wealth. You also failed to mention that you've been diverting marital funds to support a mistress, which triggers a zero-tolerance infidelity clause, stripping away every single legal right you might have had to fight this in court." "Preston, please," Bradley begged, holding his hands out in a pathetic gesture of submission. "We can find a loophole. You're the best divorce lawyer in Chicago. You can tear her apart in a lawsuit. I'll give you 20% of whatever we take. 30%, just destroy that contract." Preston picked up his initialed leather briefcase from the floor. With a sharp, echoing snap, he latched the gold buckles. He adjusted his expensive pinstripe suit, smoothing the creases with clinical precision. "To pay me 30%, you actually have to win a settlement," Preston said, his tone turning ice cold. "And to win a settlement you need a case. You don't have one. You have a legally binding contract that you drafted yourself, which explicitly guarantees you leave with absolutely nothing. Furthermore, you've admitted to embezzling corporate funds on tape." Preston walked straight past Bradley, heading for the front door. He didn't look back. He didn't offer a polite goodbye. "You're on your own," Preston said, placing his hand on the brass doorknob. "I don't work for free." The heavy oak door slammed shut behind Preston Cole. The sharp crack echoed through the ruined living room like a judge's final gavel. Bradley froze in the middle of the shattered glass, completely abandoned by the man he thought would salvage his stolen fortune. The aggressive predator who was supposed to strip away my empire had taken one look at the undeniable facts and run for the hills. Jamal let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head in pure disbelief as he pushed himself up from the kitchen counter. Bradley stared at the empty doorway, his chest heaving wildly beneath his torn dress shirt. He looked down at his trembling hands, and then back up at the massive smart TV screen, which still displayed the undeniable forensic proof of his infidelity and corporate embezzlement. The harsh reality of his absolute legal defeat finally crushed him. The prenuptial agreement he had forced me to sign to protect his own modest savings had just locked him out of a multi-billion-dollar venture capital fortune. But instead of falling to his knees and surrendering to the consequences of his actions, his panic mutated into a dark, toxic, completely delusional rage. If the law wouldn't help him steal my wealth, he would resort to the only arena where he still believed he held absolute, unquestionable power. The corporate boardroom. Bradley wiped the sweat and blood from his forehead. His posture shifted from defeated slump to a rigid, aggressive stance. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes burning with frantic malice. "You think this is over, Diana?" he snarled, his voice trembling with desperate, unhinged arrogance. "You think a piece of paper and a cowardly lawyer mean you've won this war? You forgot who I am. I am still the Vice President of Business Development. I hold the keys to the Apex AI merger. Without my signature and direct executive approval, that historic deal doesn't move a single inch." I looked at him, my expression completely flat. He was grasping at straws, trying to forge a deadly weapon out of a mirage. Bradley paced across the room, his leather shoes crunching loudly on the broken glass of our coffee table. "Mr. Montgomery relies entirely on my risk analysis," Bradley boasted, puffing out his chest and raising his voice as if commanding a room full of subordinates. "I am the absolute gatekeeper for all tech acquisitions at our firm. If I walk into that corner office tomorrow morning and tell Montgomery that Apex AI is a massive financial liability, The deal is dead in the water. Jamal crossed his arms, watching Bradley with pure, unfiltered pity. You're talking about blatant corporate sabotage just to spite your wife. Jamal's deep voice cut through Bradley's frantic rant. You're talking about intentionally tanking a deal your boss desperately wants to close. I am talking about absolute leverage, Bradley roared, ignoring Jamal completely. He took an aggressive step toward me, his face twisting into a venomous sneer. I know how this game is played, Diana. I will tell the executive board that your brother's AI algorithms are fundamentally flawed. I will fabricate severe compliance violations and slip them into the audit files. I'll leak fake internal memos to the tech press claiming Apex AI is built on stolen intellectual property. By the time I'm done framing them, the SEC will be knocking on Liu's door. I took a slow, measured sip of my espresso. Bradley was hyperventilating now, completely drunk on his grand delusions. He really believed he was a titan of industry who could move mountains. He thought I was just a silent investor who didn't understand the cold politics of corporate acquisitions. Mr. Montgomery has deep connections with every major venture capital firm in the country, Bradley continued, a manic gleam in his bloodshot eyes. He plays golf with board members of the biggest tech conglomerates in Silicon Valley. Let me remind you, Diana, he was furious with your arrogant brother at the restaurant last night. Montgomery felt insulted. He felt publicly humiliated. He's already looking for a reason to crush Leo. He will happily help me burn Apex AI to the ground when I present him with this fabricated risk assessment. Bradley threw his arms wide, gesturing to the wrecked living room as if he had just conquered a battlefield. I will make sure Leo's company is blacklisted across the global tech sector. I'll make his proprietary software completely worthless. You wanted to protect your little empire, Diana. You wanted to hide your billions from me and humiliate me in front of my boss. Well, congratulations. You can keep your hidden money, but I'll make sure your precious little brother loses everything. Vanguard Holdings will take a massive financial hit when his company collapses. I'll make sure your investment portfolio bleeds out on the trading floor. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch or protest a single word. I just watched this pathetic, bleeding man stand in my ruined home and scream empty threats into the void. My complete lack of fear seemed to enrage him further. Bradley spun around, grabbing his ruined suit jacket from the back of the sofa. He marched toward the front door, leaving a trail of wet, bloody footprints on the polished hardwood. You will deeply regret the day you crossed me, Bradley screamed, pulling the heavy front door open and stepping onto the porch. I'm going to ruin your brother. I'm going to destroy everything you built. By tomorrow afternoon, you'll be on your knees begging me to stop. He slammed the door shut with enough force to rattle the expensive picture frames on the walls. Seconds later, the roar of his sports car engine echoed down the driveway, followed by the squeal of tires as he sped away, eager to plot his imaginary corporate vengeance. The house fell quiet, save for the faint hum of the TV screen displaying his financial crimes. Jamal let out a long breath, stepping carefully over the shattered glass to stand beside me. The man has completely lost his mind, Jamal said, shaking his head. He actually believes he has the power to bring down a unicorn tech company. He thinks Montgomery will back him after the absolute disaster at the restaurant last night. He doesn't even realize his career is already over based on the embezzlement files on that drive alone. I set my empty coffee mug on the kitchen counter. Bradley has always believed his own lies, I said quietly. He'll walk into that corporate skyscraper tomorrow morning expecting to be a kingmaker. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my calm, unbothered face. I scrolled to a specific, highly encrypted contact, bypassing all normal corporate channels and pressed dial. The phone rang once before it was answered. Leo, I said, my voice dropping to a cool, lethal cadence that signaled the absolute end of my husband's career. It's time to trigger the acquisition. Through the encrypted security feeds and audio taps Jamal had actively embedded in Bradley's corporate devices, I had a front-row seat to his final, delusional morning. Bradley woke up in the luxury downtown condo he had fraudulently purchased for his mistress. He completely ignored his bruised jaw and split lip from the pathetic brawl with his brother the day before. Rather than recognizing that his life was effectively over, he doubled down on his toxic narcissism. He put on his most expensive imported Italian power suit, tying his silk tie with aggressive, jerky movements. He truly believed that a sharp suit, a loud voice, and a ruthless attitude could rewrite reality. The morning sun reflected off the glass and steel exterior of the corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago. Bradley swaggered through the revolving glass doors of the grand atrium. Like a conquering emperor, his leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. He flashed his silver executive badge at the security gate, barely deigning to look at the guard. He rode the private executive elevator straight to the 50th floor, adjusting his white cuffs and rehearsing his manipulative talking points. He planned to stride into the boardroom and tell Mr. Montgomery that the disaster at the restaurant was actually a calculated stress test. He intended to brazenly claim he had intentionally provoked the CEO of Apex AI to expose my brother's volatile, unstable leadership. He actually thought his boss would buy this ridiculous, fabricated narrative. The moment the elevator doors slid open on the executive floor, Bradley's true toxic nature bled into the corporate hallways. A young, nervous intern named Kevin was rushing past, carefully carrying a cardboard tray of hot coffees. Bradley intentionally stepped into his path, forcing the young man to stop so abruptly that he stumbled. Hot coffee splashed over the lids, spilling onto the expensive carpet. Bradley didn't apologize or step aside. He got right in the shaking intern's face, his features twisting into a mask of pure corporate malice. He loudly told Kevin he was an incompetent waste of payroll, threatening that if he ever got in his way or spilled a single drop near his office again, he would personally ensure the kid never found another job in the city. Bradley thrived on these petty power trips. He actively drew energy from making subordinates feel small, terrified, and worthless. He continued his arrogant march down the plush-carpeted hallway, heading straight toward the open bullpen of junior analysts. He stopped abruptly at the desk of a hard-working, diligent employee named Rebecca. Without a greeting or any professional courtesy, he slammed his hand down on her desk, demanding the preliminary risk assessment files for the Apex AI merger immediately. When Rebecca calmly and professionally informed him that those specific files had already been uploaded and categorized in the secure executive server per his previous request, Bradley exploded. He berated her aggressively in front of the entire open office. He called her lazy, insubordinate, and completely replaceable. He loudly declared that he was the only person keeping the department afloat, explicitly threatening to terminate her contract before lunch. It was a pathetic and transparent display of a weak, terrified man trying to project ultimate dominance to soothe his fragile ego. Energized by the bullying, Bradley marched straight to the heavy mahogany desk of Mr. Montgomery's executive secretary. He didn't have an appointment, and he didn't check the schedule. He slammed both hands onto her pristine leather desk pad, demanding an immediate emergency meeting with the executive board. He puffed out his chest and announced in his loudest and most authoritative voice that he had personally uncovered fatal compliance failures regarding the Apex AI acquisition. He arrogantly insisted that the company's entire financial future depended on his immediate intervention and expert guidance. The secretary didn't argue with his aggressive demands. She didn't ask him to sit and wait. She simply looked up at him with a very strange, unreadable expression. It was a complex mix of deep pity, nervous apprehension, and cold realization. She picked up her phone receiver, pressed a glowing button, and softly announced that Bradley was demanding immediate entry. She nodded once, hung up the phone, and pointed smoothly toward the massive, frosted glass doors of the main boardroom at the end of the hall. She told him Mr. Montgomery was already inside, waiting for him. Bradley smiled. It was a predatory, deeply arrogant smirk. He adjusted his silk tie one last time, completely convinced his aggressive intimidation tactics had worked. He believed the executive board was sitting in that room, waiting with bated breath for his brilliant, fictional risk analysis. He thought he was about to play the role of the ultimate corporate savior, the vigilant VP who bravely rescued the company from a disastrous merger with my brother. He genuinely believed he was about to secure a massive promotion, destroy Leah's company, and use his newly acquired, untouchable corporate power to crush me in a brutal divorce court. He walked down the long corridor, every step driven by pure, unadulterated hubris and delusion. He reached out, pushing the heavy glass doors of the boardroom open with force. The moment he stepped inside, he fully expected to command the room, a triumphant, arrogant greeting already forming on his lips. But the words died instantly in his throat. The energy in the massive room was completely wrong. It was dead silent, freezing cold, and incredibly suffocating. Instead of finding an eager audience ready to crown him a corporate hero, he found Mr. Montgomery sitting rigidly at the far end of the massive oak conference table. The senior executive looked physically ill. Mr. Montgomery was sweating profusely, his face pale and slick with a cold sheen, his expensive silk tie loosened around his collar. And he wasn't sitting alone. Flanking the terrified executive were 6 top-tier corporate attorneys, men and women in immaculate charcoal suits, their faces carved of solid stone. They did not look at Bradley with respect or eager anticipation. They looked at him the way one looks at a condemned man already standing on the gallows with the rope tightening. Bradley refused to read the terrible atmosphere in the room. His immense arrogance acted as a thick blindfold. He looked at the 6 expressionless corporate lawyers flanking his boss and immediately assumed they were there to execute his brilliant sabotage strategy. Bradley was convinced Mr. Montgomery had assembled this legal strike team to preemptively kill the Apex AI merger and prepare for a massive commercial lawsuit. Bradley puffed out his chest, completely ignoring the fact that his boss was sweating through his tailored shirt. He marched halfway down the long oak table and slammed his leather briefcase down with heavy, aggressive force. "Mr. Montgomery," Bradley began, his voice booming with unearned confidence, "I'm glad you brought the legal team. I've spent the entire night compiling an incredibly disastrous risk assessment of the Apex AI acquisition. Their proprietary algorithms are a complete fraud. We have zero legal obligation to move forward. I've uncovered massive compliance violations that give us the perfect leverage to tear up the term sheet and blacklist them across the industry." He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the polished wood, smiling like a predatory shark. "Under my guidance, we can completely absorb their market share once the SEC dismantles their operations. I just need your authorization to leak these preliminary findings to the tech press by noon." Mr. Montgomery didn't return the smile. He didn't praise his ambitious vice president. The senior executive looked like he was on the verge of a massive cardiac event. His eyes were squeezed shut, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw breath. He slowly raised a heavily trembling hand, signaling for Bradley to stop talking immediately. Bradley, completely blind to his impending doom, misinterpreted the gesture. He believed his boss was simply overwhelmed by the absolute brilliance of the strategy. "I know it's a bold play, sir," Bradley continued, raising his voice as he paced the length of the table. "But this is how we win. This is how we crush the competition and secure our legacy." "Shut your mouth," Mr. Montgomery whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of absolute terror. He opened his eyes, staring at Bradley with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "I said, shut your mouth, you incompetent fool. You have absolutely no idea what you've done." Bradley froze, his triumphant smirk slowly sliding off his bruised face. "Sir, I'm trying to save this company," he stammered, deeply confused by the sudden hostility. "I'm trying to protect our assets." Before Bradley could utter another pathetic, delusional syllable, the heavy mahogany double doors at the far end of the boardroom unlocked with a loud, definitive click. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. The 6 elite corporate attorneys stood up from their chairs instantly, adjusting their jackets and standing rigidly at attention. Mr. Montgomery gripped the edges of the oak table, using it to support his trembling frame. Bradley stood completely frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs, his eyes glued to the entryway. The doors pushed open. The sharp, authoritative click of high heels on the polished hardwood floor echoed through the room like a metronome, counting down the final seconds of Bradley's career. I walked into the boardroom. The plain, quiet, submissive wife in the cheap wrap dress who cut coupons was completely gone. I wore a sharp, custom midnight black power suit that radiated a lethal, untouchable authority. My posture was flawless. My gaze held zero mercy. I didn't look like a woman who played with dirt in a small suburban plant shop. I looked like the apex predator of the global financial ecosystem. I looked like the owner of the very ground they stood on. And I didn't enter alone. Leah walked through those mahogany doors exactly 1 step behind my right shoulder. The radiant, untouchable tech billionaire who had been viewed with absolute awe at the restaurant the night before was actively displaying absolute, unwavering subservience. He held zero arrogance. He was operating solely as my loyal deputy, his sharp eyes scanning the room to ensure my path was clear. Walking on my left, level with Leo, was Jamal. My brilliant brother-in-law was also dressed in an immaculate, dark custom suit. He carried a heavy, locked metal briefcase loaded with the digital execution of my husband's entire miserable existence. Jamal looked completely unbothered, moving with the quiet, lethal confidence of a man who held every single card in his hand. The three of us marched through the massive boardroom. Our synchronized footsteps sounded like an army on the march. The corporate lawyers parted instantly, stepping back several feet to create a wide, unobstructed path straight to the head of the table. Bradley's brain completely short-circuited. The sight of his abused, underestimated wife leading a billionaire CEO and the brother-in-law he despised into his highly restricted corporate sanctuary shattered his fragile mind. He could not process the overwhelming display of power, and his reality collapsed. "What is the meaning of this?" Bradley shrieked, his voice climbing to a hysterical, unhinged frequency. "What is she doing here?" He spun to face Mr. Montgomery, gesturing wildly at me. "Sir, you need to call security immediately. This is my crazy, psychotic wife. She is having a mental breakdown. And that guy with the briefcase is just a low-level IT worker. They are trespassing in a restricted corporate zone. Get them out of here before they compromise the data servers. Call the police, have them arrested." Bradley lunged toward the intercom on the table, desperately trying to hit the security button. He was hyperventilating, his eyes filled with a wild, animalistic panic. "I'll handle this, sir," Bradley yelled, spit flying from his lips. "I'll have them thrown onto the street." Mr. Montgomery didn't reach for the security button. He didn't look at Bradley. He ignored the screaming vice president standing in front of him entirely. The senior executive swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat running down his pale temple. As I approached the head of the long oak table, Mr. Montgomery stepped completely away from the massive high-backed leather chair. The ultimate seat of power in this room, the throne Bradley had spent his entire miserable career trying to reach, was left vacant. Mr. Montgomery bowed his head in deep, silent reverence. He reached out a trembling hand, gesturing respectfully toward the empty center chair, offering his absolute seat of power directly to me. I didn't hesitate. I moved with the fluid grace of someone completely accustomed to wielding absolute power. I walked past Bradley, who was frozen in a grotesque half-panic stance, and stood at the head of the long oak table. The leather chair was still warm from Mr. Montgomery, but the cold authority I brought into the space instantly dropped the room's temperature to freezing. I sat down. I smoothed my posture perfectly, resting my forearms against the polished mahogany edge. Leo took his position, standing right beside my right shoulder, while Jamal stood firmly on my left, placing the heavy metal briefcase squarely on the table. Bradley stared at Mr. Montgomery, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked like a man who had just watched gravity suddenly reverse. He searched his boss's face frantically, looking for any sign that this was a joke, a hidden camera, or a medical emergency. "Sir," Bradley choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, what are you doing? Why is she sitting there? Call security, have her removed." Mr. Montgomery stood up straight, though his hands remained tightly clasped to hide the violent shaking. He refused to make eye contact with his former favorite vice president. Instead, he addressed the room of elite corporate lawyers and the terrified man standing in the center of the floor. "Bradley, shut your mouth and listen very carefully," Mr. Montgomery said, his voice stripped of all warmth replaced by pure survival instinct. "You are completely out of your depth. Allow me to formally introduce you to the woman sitting in my chair. Bradley, this is the founder and chairwoman of Vanguard Holdings." Bradley stumbled back a step, as if he had been punched hard in the chest. No. "That's impossible. Vanguard is a faceless private equity trust. She's my wife. She runs a dirt shop. She sells potted ferns." "As of exactly 8 o'clock this morning," Mr. Montgomery continued, raising his voice to drown out Bradley's pathetic, frantic denials, "Vanguard Holdings executed a hostile takeover. They formally acquired a 51% controlling stake in this corporation. The board of directors held an emergency vote at dawn. The transaction has cleared. The transfer of power is absolute, and it is irreversible." The reality hit Bradley with the devastating force of a freight train. The heavy corporate terminology finally penetrated his thick skull. 51% controlling stake, Vanguard Holdings, the pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind. At the restaurant, Leo calling her big sister wasn't just a family endearment, it was a strict hierarchy of absolute power. She hadn't just given Leo a small family loan. She had secretly engineered the entire tech ecosystem. She was the Leviathan. She was the apex predator of the venture capital world. She owned the private equity firm that owned Apex AI, and now she owned the very skyscraper he was standing in. Bradley's eyes darted around the room, looking at the faces of the 6 elite lawyers. He was searching desperately for a single sympathetic look, a single ally who could tell him this was just a nightmare and he would wake up soon. The lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman in a crisp grey suit, slid a thick, bound acquisition summary across the table. It glided across the polished wood, coming to a stop directly in front of Bradley's fingertips. The cover was printed with the heavy black ink emblem of Vanguard Holdings, and directly beneath it was my signature. The same signature he had watched me write on grocery lists and utility bills was now authorizing the purchase of his entire professional reality. Bradley reached out a trembling hand. His fingers brushed the heavy cardstock. He stared at my signature, his mind shattered. He was not a corporate titan. He was not a mastermind holding the keys to a merger. He was an insignificant, easily replaceable middle manager employed by his own wife. Every paycheck he had ever bragged about, every bonus he had used to secretly fund his downtown love nest, every shred of professional status he had wielded like a weapon to make himself feel superior to me, all of it had existed entirely under my mercy. I was the creator of his universe, and I was about to dismantle it. He looked up from the document, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The sheer terror in his gaze was intoxicating. He finally understood the gravity of his fatal mistake. He hadn't just ruined his marriage last night. He had committed professional suicide on an astronomical scale. His knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself against the edge of the conference table, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the wood to stay upright. "Diana," Bradley whispered, his voice hollow and broken, stripped of all the arrogant bravado he had brought into the building. "You bought the company. You bought my company." "I bought my company, Bradley," I corrected him, my voice echoing coldly in the silent boardroom. "You just happened to work here temporarily." He opened his mouth to beg. I could see the pathetic apologies forming on his lips. He was ready to drop to his knees right there in the boardroom, just like he had at the restaurant, just like he had in our ruined living room. He was ready to plead for his job, his reputation, and the shred of wealth he had arrogantly thought he could steal from me in a divorce court. He would promise to be a better husband, a better man, a loyal employee. I didn't give him the satisfaction of speaking. I hadn't come to this skyscraper to listen to his desperate excuses. I had come to execute a perfect, surgical extraction of a corporate parasite. I leaned back into the chairman's chair. I lifted my hands, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany armrests, and steepled my fingers. I looked past Bradley's sweating, panicked face, focusing all my attention on the man standing loyally to my left. The room held its collective breath. The corporate lawyers waited in dead silence. Mr. Montgomery dabbed his forehead with a silk handkerchief. Bradley stared at me in frozen, helpless horror. "Jamal," I said, my voice carrying the absolute, unquestionable authority of a corporate executioner, "please present your independent audit findings to the board." Jamal nodded, his expression devoid of mercy. He placed the heavy metal briefcase on the polished mahogany table and popped the latches with a sharp click. He pulled out a sleek laptop, connecting it to the boardroom's main display system with an encrypted cable. The massive projection screen on the far wall hummed to life. The Vanguard Holdings corporate logo flashed briefly before being replaced by a highly complex, color-coded financial spreadsheet. Bradley swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically across the rows of data. He recognized the account numbers. He recognized the shell companies. He recognized the digital footprints he had spent thousands of dollars trying to erase from the corporate servers. "Members of the board," Jamal began, his deep voice commanding absolute attention. "As an independent cybersecurity auditor hired directly by Vanguard Holdings, I have conducted a forensic trace of all executive financial activity within this firm over the past 36 months. My objective was to identify compliance vulnerabilities prior to our acquisition. What I uncovered is a highly sophisticated, systematic embezzlement operation executed exclusively by your Vice President of Business Development, Bradley." Mr. Montgomery's face turned a worrying shade of pale grey. The 6 corporate lawyers leaned forward, their eyes locking onto the screen, ready to dissect the corporate slaughter. Jamal pressed a button on his presentation remote. The screen transitioned to a series of intercepted emails, offshore routing numbers, and fabricated vendor invoices. Bradley was not only draining funds from his marital accounts to fund a luxury penthouse for his 24-year-old mistress, Jamal stated clearly, exposing Bradley's domestic disgrace to the room. He was actively using his executive clearances to bleed this company dry. He created phantom vendor accounts. He approved inflated invoices for marketing services that were never actually rendered. He then routed those excess corporate funds through shell companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, ultimately funneling the stolen capital directly into his own private pockets. Jamal flipped to the next slide, revealing a web of international wire transfers. Furthermore, Jamal continued, his tone clinical and lethal, Bradley accepted highly aggressive, illegal kickbacks from overseas suppliers in exchange for ensuring they secured our hardware contracts. He demanded a 10% premium on every shipment, which was funneled directly into an untraceable crypto wallet. Bradley gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He opened his mouth to deny the charges, to scream that the data was fabricated, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The evidence was irrefutable. Jamal had pulled the internal communication logs. He had matched the IP addresses. Every single dollar stolen was meticulously traced and documented. The total volume of embezzled corporate capital exceeds $4 million, Jamal concluded, stepping back and crossing his arms. These files have been compiled into a secure, encrypted archive. They are ready for immediate transfer to the SEC and the FBI. Mr. Montgomery buried his face in his hands, groaning in pure professional agony. The lead corporate attorney pushed her glasses up her nose, looking at Bradley as if he were a highly infectious disease. She turned to me and gave a slight nod, signaling that the legal threshold for a catastrophic termination had been thoroughly surpassed. I stood up from the chairman's chair. I buttoned the jacket of my midnight black power suit, projecting the absolute lethal authority of a corporate executioner. I looked down at the man who had spent 5 years treating me like unpaid help, the man who had mocked my background, insulted my family, and attempted to publicly humiliate me in a luxury restaurant just last night. Bradley, I said, my voice echoing like ice cracking over a frozen lake, your employment with this firm is not suspended. You will not be receiving severance. You will not have the opportunity to salvage your reputation with a polite resignation. Bradley dropped to his knees. His expensive Italian trousers hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, pathetic thud. Diana, please, he begged, tears streaming down his bruised, battered face. Please don't do this. I'll pay all the money back. I'll sell the condo. I'll do whatever you want, just don't send me to prison. I looked down at him with zero pity. As the chairwoman of Vanguard Holdings and the majority shareholder of this corporation, I am formally terminating you with cause. You are fired for gross moral turpitude, massive corporate fraud, and felony embezzlement. I walked around the table, standing directly over his kneeling, trembling frame. You forfeit all unvested stock options. Your corporate pension is permanently frozen. Your access to this building, the servers, and the personnel is immediately revoked. My legal team will be delivering Jamal's forensic audit directly to the federal prosecutors by noon today. You are blacklisted across the global tech sector. You will never work in a corporate office again. You will face federal indictment and you will go to federal prison. Bradley sobbed violently, clutching his stomach as if he had been physically disemboweled. His arrogant bluster, his fake wealth, and his toxic superiority were completely gone. He was nothing more than a broken, terrified criminal waiting for the authorities. The man who had ordered me to wait in the coat check was now a weeping mess on my corporate floor. I turned my back, preparing to call security to have him dragged out of my building. But before I could deliver the order, a sharp, grating sound cut through the heavy tension of the boardroom. A cell phone was ringing. The aggressive, generic ringtone echoed loudly. The sound was coming from Bradley's torn suit jacket pocket. Bradley flinched. With a trembling, blood-stained hand, he slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the phone. The caller ID flashed brightly on the screen, visible to everyone in the room. It was his mother, Patricia. Answer it, I commanded, my tone absolutely non-negotiable. Put it on speaker. His thumb shaking violently, Bradley swiped the screen and tapped the speaker icon. He dropped the phone onto the polished oak table. Bradley, Patricia shrieked. Her voice wasn't just frantic. It was a shredded, hysterical scream of pure, unadulterated panic. The sound boomed through the boardroom speakers, vibrating against the glass walls. "Bradley, where are you? You have to come home right now." "Mom, what's wrong?" Bradley gasped, his voice cracking. "The bank," Patricia sobbed, her words tumbling out in a hyperventilating rush. "The bank just showed up with the sheriff's department. They are throwing us out. Spencer is crying on the driveway. Bradley, they are padlocking the doors, they are changing the locks. They say the loan you guaranteed is in absolute default. They say you used my house as collateral for your massive business debts, and you haven't made a payment in months. They formally foreclosed on the property today. We lost everything. My friends from the country club are driving by, staring at us. We are being thrown onto the street." Patricia's hysterical screams continued to echo from the phone resting on the mahogany table. She wailed about the neighbors watching her, about the moving trucks rolling into the driveway, about the sudden, undeniable reality of her instant poverty. Bradley stared at the device with hollow, horrified eyes. His brain had completely shut down. The fortress of arrogance he had spent his entire life building had turned to ash in less than 24 hours. I reached out and tapped the red button on the screen. The call disconnected, throwing the massive boardroom back into a heavy, suffocating silence. I turned my gaze to Mr. Montgomery and the 6 corporate lawyers. I gave them a simple, dismissive nod. "That will be all for today, gentlemen. Please clear the room." The elite legal team scrambled to obey. They packed their briefcases with frantic speed, desperate to escape the blast radius of Bradley's ruined life. Mr. Montgomery practically ran toward the mahogany double doors, never once looking back at the vice president he had groomed to succeed him. Leo offered me a respectful nod before stepping into the hallway to coordinate the executive transition team. The heavy doors clicked shut, sealing the room. The boardroom was empty, save for myself, Jamal, and the weeping man broken on the floor. Bradley was a pathetic sight. His custom Italian trousers were scuffed and dirty at the knees. His expensive silk tie hung limply around his neck, stained with the blood from his split lip. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with desperate, cowardly tears. The terrible reality that his mother was currently being evicted because of his own fraudulent financial maneuvering had finally shattered his remaining fragile sanity. He collapsed forward, his palms flat against the hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably. It was a loud, wet, gasping sound. He was completely stripped of his corporate armor, reduced to a trembling mess begging for mercy. "Diana, please," Bradley choked out, his voice cracking severely. "You have to understand the pressure I was under. You have to know how incredibly difficult it is to maintain this level of corporate success. The stress was eating me alive. I was working 80 hours a week trying to secure our future. The expectations crushed me. I made mistakes. I know I made horrible financial mistakes, but I was just trying to cope with the absolute, overwhelming anxiety of my position." He crawled forward a few inches, his bloody hands reaching out, hovering inches away from my black leather heels. He didn't dare touch me. "Vanessa meant absolutely nothing to me," Bradley pleaded, crying harder as he tried to spin his 2-year affair into a tragic symptom of job burnout. "She was just a distraction, a meaningless, stupid distraction to escape the relentless pressure of this company. And the money, Diana, the corporate funds I took, I was going to invest them and pay everything back. I swear I was. I just wanted to build a massive safety net for us. I wanted to give you the luxury you deserved. Please, you have to believe that I never wanted to hurt you. Give me a second chance. I'll go to rehab. I'll go to therapy. I'll do whatever you ask. Just please don't ruin me." I looked down at him with zero pity. My expression could have been carved from solid ice. I felt absolutely nothing for the weeping man at my feet. "Don't blame your calculated cruelty on corporate stress," I said, my voice echoing sharply in the empty room. "Millions of people experience extreme stress every day, Bradley. They don't cope by embezzling millions of dollars, funding a luxury condo for a fitness instructor, or taking out fraudulent mortgages that leave their own mothers homeless. You didn't steal because you were anxious. You stole because you felt entitled. You genuinely believed you were smarter than everyone else in this building." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, forcing him to look up into my merciless gaze. "And don't stand here and tell me you wanted to give me a luxurious life," I continued, my voice dropping to a deadly, quiet cadence. "We both know how much you relied on keeping me beneath you. You fed on it. You nourished your fragile, pathetic ego by ensuring I always felt financially dependent and socially inferior. I remember the look on your face at the restaurant last night. I remember the exact smirk when you slid that $4,000 bill across the table, fully expecting my card to decline. I remember how your eyes danced with malicious joy when you told me to go wait in the coat check like an obedient dog. Bradley flinched, closing his eyes tightly, as the reality of his own actions was weaponized against him. You enjoyed humiliating me when you thought I was weak, I stated, delivering the absolute truth with zero padding. You loved playing the dominant, successful savior who dragged his poor wife out of the gutter. You treated Jamal and Megan like second-class citizens because it made you feel like a king. You didn't make mistakes, Bradley. You operated exactly according to your character. And now, you're just afraid because your victim turned out to be the executioner. Jamal stepped forward from the shadows of the room. He didn't say a word. He simply popped open his heavy metal briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He handed it to me with a respectful nod. I took the envelope and tossed it onto the center of the polished oak table. It landed with a heavy, decisive thud right next to Bradley's discarded cell phone. Bradley stared at the envelope, his breath catching in his throat. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his hands gripping the edge of the conference table for support. His eyes darted between the envelope and my face, silently begging for a reprieve that was never going to come. "Sign the divorce papers, Bradley," I commanded, my voice stripping away his final illusions of hope. "I am offering you the fastest, most brutal legal separation in this state's history. You will forfeit all claims to any marital assets. You will accept the infidelity clauses in the prenup with zero contest. You will leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it, nothing." He stared at the documents, his chest heaving. "And if I refuse," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear, "if I demand my own lawyers review this first?" I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the mahogany table, pinning him with my gaze. "If you hesitate for even a single second," I replied, every syllable dripping with absolute venom, "Jamal will transmit the entire embezzlement archive to the FBI. You will leave this skyscraper in handcuffs, and you will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Choose your destiny, right now, Bradley." Bradley stared at the thick manila envelope resting on the polished mahogany table. His breathing was rapid, shallow, and uneven. The air in the massive corporate boardroom felt incredibly thin, as if the room itself was rejecting his presence. He looked at Jamal, who stood completely motionless, his hand resting casually over the keyboard of his encrypted laptop. Jamal wasn't bluffing. The cybersecurity auditor had the routing codes to the federal authorities queued up, waiting for a single keystroke. A violent tremor took over Bradley's hands. He slowly reached out his stained, bruised fingers, touching the edge of the envelope. He slid the thick stack of legal documents from the sleeve. The stark white paper looked incredibly bright under the recessed boardroom lights. The bold black text at the top of the first page read, "Agreement for dissolution of marriage and complete forfeiture of assets." He swallowed hard, the sound incredibly loud in the dead silent room. He turned to the second page, his eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs Preston Cole had tried and failed to circumvent. Every single clause was a nail in his coffin. He was formally admitting to gross financial misconduct during the marriage. He was legally confirming the validity of the infidelity clause in our prenup. He was signing over the deed to the downtown luxury condo, relinquishing any claim to the equity in our suburban home, and formally waiving all rights to spousal support, legal fee reimbursement, and future litigation. He was stripping himself entirely bare. "Diana, please," Bradley whispered one last time, a pathetic, broken whimper that barely carried across the table. "I have nothing left. If I sign this, I am on the street with the clothes on my back. My mother is losing her house. My career is completely destroyed. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to live?" "You'll live exactly the way you expected me to live when you threw that credit card across the table last night," I replied without a single shred of warmth. "You'll figure it out, or you won't. That is no longer my concern. The clock is ticking, Bradley. Jamal is waiting." A choked, agonizing sob tore from his throat. The final illusion of hope, that he could somehow manipulate his way out of this nightmare, crumbled entirely. He was no longer a smooth-talking executive. He was a cornered criminal staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. Bradley reached for the heavy silver pen resting in the center of the conference table. His hand shook so violently he could barely grip the metal casing. He hovered the tip over the first signature line. A large tear fell from his cheek, splashing onto the white paper, blurring the black ink of the legal text. He pressed the pen down. He signed his name. The signature was a messy, frantic scribble, completely devoid of the aggressive, arrogant flourish he usually used on corporate contracts. He flipped to the next page, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. He signed the asset forfeiture addendum. He signed the property transfer deed for the luxury condo. He initialed every single page, acknowledging his infidelity and his complete relinquishment of all marital rights. The only sound in the massive, luxurious boardroom was the scratching of the silver pen against heavy paper, and the wet, miserable sound of a ruined man crying over his own destruction. Jamal observed the entire process with cold, clinical detachment, acting as the official witness to his former brother-in-law's complete unraveling. Bradley reached the final page. He stared at the last signature line for a long, agonizing moment. This was the final cut of our legal connection. This was the exact second his status as the husband of a billionaire vanished. He let out a low, pathetic groan, closed his eyes, and scribbled his name for the last time. He dropped the silver pen. It clattered against the polished oak table, rolling away from him. He pushed the stack of signed documents across the mahogany surface toward me, his head lowered, his shoulders slumped in absolute catastrophic defeat. He had nothing left to fight with. He was completely empty, stripped of his wife, his high-paying job, his luxury house, his stolen money, and his entire professional reputation. I reached out, placing my hand firmly on the stack of divorce papers. I pulled them toward me, reviewing every single page with slow, meticulous care. I verified every signature, every initial, and every date. It was executed flawlessly. The legal separation was absolute. I tapped the edges of the papers against the table to align them, then slid them back into the manila envelope. I handed the envelope to Jamal. He accepted it with a respectful nod, securing it inside his metal briefcase next to the encrypted corporate audit files. The transaction was officially complete. I stood up straight, buttoning the jacket of my midnight black power suit. I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor of the corporate skyscraper he had once thought he ruled. He was still weeping, his hands covering his bruised face, his expensive suit a complete wreck. He looked incredibly small. "Bradley," I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic sobbing with razor-sharp clarity. He slowly lowered his hands, looking up at me through bloodshot, terrified eyes. He looked as though he was bracing himself for a blow. "Remember what you said to me at the restaurant last night?" I asked, locking his gaze with lethal intensity. "You looked me in the eye and told me to leave. You said this table is reserved for important people." Bradley flinched, fresh tears spilling over his cheeks, as the memory of his own staggering arrogance was weaponized against him. "You were right," I continued, my voice dropping to a quiet, devastating cadence. "It is reserved for important people, but you forgot one crucial detail, Bradley. I own the restaurant too." I didn't wait for him to answer. There was absolutely nothing left for him to say. I turned, the sharp click of my heels striking the polished hardwood floor like a judge's final gavel. I walked with perfect posture, projecting the absolute authority of a woman who had just conquered an empire and purged a parasite from her life. Jamal walked beside me, holding the briefcase containing my absolute freedom. We headed toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the end of the room. I reached out, pushing the heavy glass and wood open, stepping out into the bustling, brightly lit executive hallway where my new life was waiting. I didn't look back. I stepped out of the boardroom, leaving Bradley completely alone in that massive, silent executive suite. The heavy mahogany double doors clicked shut behind us. The sound effectively locked Bradley inside his own private tomb, completely sealing him off from the world of power he had so desperately worshipped. I stood in the wide, sunlit executive lobby, taking a deep breath of the fresh, air-conditioned air. The atmosphere was completely different from the suffocating panic of the boardroom we had just exited. Young executives and administrative assistants bustled across the polished marble floor, holding sleek tablets and steaming cups of coffee. They had absolutely no idea that a complete corporate slaughter had just taken place only a few feet away. I stopped and turned to face Jamal. The brilliant cybersecurity auditor stood tall beside me, his grip firm on the metal briefcase containing my signed divorce papers and absolute freedom. His expression remained completely professional, but I could see a quiet, profound satisfaction shining in his dark eyes. He had endured years of racial microaggressions, classist insults, and blatant disrespect from my former in-laws. Today, he had delivered the decisive blow that brought their fragile, arrogant empire crashing down. "You risked your entire career for me today," I said, my voice dropping to a tone of absolute, unwavering sincerity. "You bypassed corporate-level firewalls. You extracted encrypted executive data. If Bradley had possessed even a fraction of the corporate power he claimed, he could have buried you in federal lawsuits. You stood up to his mother and brother, knowing full well that the fallout could have permanently damaged your own marriage to Megan. You put yourself directly in the line of fire to protect me." Jamal offered a calm, measured smile. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, radiating a quiet, untouchable aura of dignity. "Bradley was a parasite," Jamal replied, his deep voice carrying an unshakable conviction. "He built his fragile ego entirely on stepping on the necks of people he deemed beneath him. He looked at my skin color and my job title, and assumed I was just the family tech support. He looked at your simple clothes and your quiet demeanor, and assumed you were a helpless victim he could manipulate at will. I didn't do this just for you, Diana. I did this because exposing toxic, arrogant frauds is the exact reason I got into cybersecurity in the first place. From the moment we met, you treated me with genuine respect. Bringing you the weapons you needed to dismantle him was my absolute privilege." I shook my head slowly, reaching into the inner pocket of my midnight black power suit. "A simple thank you is completely inadequate for the loyalty and brilliance you demonstrated today. Men like Bradley believe power is something you steal from others. I believe real power is what you build with the people who stand beside you when the room gets dark." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crisp, heavy envelope embossed with the seal of Vanguard Holdings. I slid it across the polished marble counter and handed it to him. "I don't want you working as an independent contractor anymore," I said, my voice steady. "No more auditing second-rate tech firms, and no more dealing with arrogant middle managers who don't have the capacity to understand your brilliance." Jamal took the envelope, a slight frown of confusion wrinkling his forehead. He broke the wax seal, sliding the thick, heavy document out into the bright light of the corporate lobby. His eyes ran over the bold text at the top of the page, and he froze. "It's an executive employment contract," I declared. "I am formally appointing you as the Chief Information Security Officer for the entire Vanguard Holdings portfolio. You won't report to a board of directors. You report exclusively to me. You will have absolute, unchecked authority over the digital infrastructure of every single company, startup, and venture capital fund under my control. The base salary is on page 2, along with an aggressive equity package that makes the highest corporate bonus Bradley ever bragged about look like pocket change." Jamal stared at the numbers on the page. For the first time since I had known him, this remarkably steady, unshakable man looked genuinely stunned. He read the compensation package twice, his jaw tightening as the sheer weight of the offer sank in. This wasn't just a job, it was a kingmaker position. It was the ultimate, undeniable recognition of an extraordinary mind that my former in-laws had spent years trying to suppress. "Diana," Jamal said, taking a slow breath, his voice thick with emotion, "this is a seat at the very top table. This is executive control over billions of dollars in digital assets." "It is exactly where you belong," I corrected him gently. "You proved your absolute integrity when you handed that drive to me instead of using it to blackmail Bradley. You are brilliant, you know how to be ruthless when necessary, and your loyalty is unbreakable. I need a head of security who builds fortresses and dismantles threats before they even appear. If you want it, the position is yours." Jamal looked up from the contract, his dark eyes locking onto mine. A quiet, unspoken understanding passed between us, two former outsiders who had just conquered the very hierarchy that tried to keep them down. He folded the contract with care, sliding it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. "I accept, Chairwoman. You have my absolute loyalty." "Perfect," I said, a genuine, warm smile finally breaking across my face. "Now, let's leave this miserable building." We turned and walked side by side down the wide marble corridor, heading straight for the private executive elevator, reserved for top leadership. The heavy tension of the morning had completely evaporated, replaced by the exhilarating rush of a massive victory. As we approached the polished steel doors, a soft chime announced its arrival. The heavy metal slid open silently to reveal Leo standing inside the wood-paneled car. My brilliant younger brother had already shed the aggressive, intimidating billionaire mask he had worn in the boardroom. He was leaning casually against the brass railing, hands in his pockets, with a brilliant, triumphant grin on his face. "The conquering heroes arrive," Leaf said, stepping aside to make room for us. He looked at Jamal, his eyes shining with deep respect. "I hear you got the final signature. Welcome to the inner circle, Jamal. My security team has been begging me to hire you for 2 years. Jamal let out a low chuckle, stepping into the elevator beside me. "It is an absolute privilege, Leo. We have a lot of work to do." I stood between the two smartest, most loyal men I had ever known. The polished steel doors slid shut, sealing us in a quiet, safe space. As the elevator began its rapid, smooth descent to the lobby, I caught our reflection in the mirrored doors. We were no longer bound by toxic expectations or the desperate, greedy demands of a fraudulent family. We were bound by mutual respect, shared brilliance, and absolute trust. We were a new, unbreakable chosen family, descending from the corporate tower to run the empire we had rightfully earned. 3 weeks passed. The dust over the Chicago skyline had settled, but the shockwaves from that morning in the boardroom continued to dismantle the lives of the people who had tried to bury me. Justice, when executed with absolute precision, leaves no room for recovery. The universe has a beautiful way of balancing the scales, and the consequences that fell upon my former husband's family were swift, brutal, and entirely self-inflicted. Bradley's fall from the corporate penthouse to the absolute bottom of the food chain happened so fast it was dizzying. The FBI didn't make polite requests for interviews. They didn't send warning letters. After receiving Jamal's meticulous audit, federal agents raided Bradley's luxury downtown condo at dawn, just a day after our divorce was finalized. His 24-year-old mistress, the fitness instructor he had drained our joint assets to impress, took one look at the federal agents swarming the apartment and immediately turned state's evidence to save herself. She packed her designer bags, surrendered every gift he had bought her with stolen money, and vanished before the sun was fully up. She left Bradley standing on the cold pavement in handcuffs, shivering in his pajamas, while his neighbors watched the entire humiliating spectacle. Because the infidelity clause in our prenup stripped him of all marital assets, and the corporate audit immediately froze his remaining personal accounts, Bradley couldn't afford a high-priced defense team. The ruthless attorneys he used to idolize refused to take his calls. He was forced to accept a heavily overworked public defender to handle his massive embezzlement charges. To pay his basic legal fees and keep a roof over his head while awaiting federal trial, the former vice president of business development was forced to take the only job willing to hire a publicly indicted felon. He accepted a night shift position at a commercial laundry plant in the industrial outskirts of the city. The arrogant man who used to scream at interns for spilling coffee now spent 8 hours a night dragging heavy, wet sheets into massive industrial washing machines. His hands were blistered, his back ached, and his pride was ground into nothing under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the factory floor. Patricia and Spencer met an equally devastating reality. The bank didn't care about Patricia's reputation at the country club, nor did they care about her desperate screams for extension. The foreclosure on her home was swift and merciless. They were physically evicted from the spacious suburban house, the very home my quiet financial support had secretly maintained for years. Stripped of Bradley's stolen income and completely cut off from my wealth, they were forced to rent a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown building overlooking a noisy, smog-choked highway overpass. The irony was absolute poetic justice. The people who had placed money, status, and superficial appearances above basic human decency were now mired in the exact kind of squalor they had spent their entire lives mocking. The tiny apartment quickly became a pressure cooker of blame and resentment. Patricia spent her mornings screaming at Spencer to get a job, calling him a lazy parasite who had ruined her life. Spencer screamed back just as loudly, his voice cutting through the thin walls of the cheap apartment as he viciously blamed his mother for raising him to expect a massive inheritance that didn't exist. He was forced to pawn his expensive gaming computer, his designer tracksuits, and his luxury watches just to keep the electricity from being cut off. They tore at each other daily, consumed by their own miserable greed. They had spent 5 years stepping on my neck, looking down on my simple wrap dresses and my modest plant shop. They never realized that I was the single structural beam keeping their fragile, debt-ridden universe from collapsing into ash. By pushing me away to feed their own pathetic egos, they had engineered their own complete destruction. They had lost the only person who cared enough to keep them stable. Now they had absolutely nothing left but each other, and they hated every second of it. Bradley dragged his feet into his dim studio apartment after a grueling night shift. His body was a mass of aches. His cheap polyester uniform reeked of industrial bleach, and his spirit was completely broken. The tiny studio was dark, damp, and freezing. He collapsed onto a stained, second-hand sofa he had salvaged from a local thrift store. Picking up a cracked remote, he turned on a small, outdated television resting on a plastic milk crate, just wanting some background noise to drown out the suffocating silence of his ruined life. The morning financial news broadcast flickered on the screen, illuminating the peeling wallpaper of his cramped living space. The anchor sat behind a polished glass desk in a sharp suit, a painful reminder of the world Bradley had permanently lost. A bright, high-definition graphic displaying the Vanguard Holdings emblem floated next to the anchor's shoulder. Bradley froze, his bloodshot, exhausted eyes locked onto the screen as the news anchor delivered a breaking headline. The cheap plastic water bottle in his hand slipped, spilling lukewarm water onto his worn work boots. He reached out to raise the volume, his blistered hands shaking violently. My name echoed through his miserable, cramped apartment. The anchor smiled brightly at the camera, announcing Vanguard Holdings' massive new philanthropic initiative, a move that officially cemented my absolute dominance over the city's financial sector. The charitable initiative, which was being broadcast on every major financial news network in the country, was the final, devastating nail in my ex-husband's coffin. As the news anchor detailed my $50 million pledge to fund female-led startups, I knew Bradley was watching from his pathetic, freezing apartment. I knew he was staring at that screen, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the wealth he had permanently lost due to his own staggering arrogance. The universe had delivered its final, indisputable verdict. I was thriving at the absolute pinnacle of corporate power, while he was washing industrial sheets for minimum wage. I stood before the towering floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, looking out over the glittering expanse of the Chicago skyline. The city stretched out beneath me, a massive grid of steel and glass fully illuminated by the brilliant colors of the setting sun. Behind me, the elegant, low hum of a high-profile corporate event filled the spacious suite. The clink of crystal champagne flutes, the murmur of confident networking, and the exchange of revolutionary ideas echoed through the headquarters of Vanguard Holdings. I was hosting our inaugural Female Entrepreneurs Summit, the very initiative the news anchors were currently praising on a global scale. I turned away from the glass, letting my gaze drift over the spectacular scene in my own boardroom. 50 of the most innovative, ruthless, and brilliant women in the industry were gathered around my mahogany table. I was no longer the quiet, submissive wife hiding in the shadow of a toxic marriage. I had shed the faded charcoal-wrapped dresses and the dirt-stained gardening aprons, the disguises I had once worn to appease a deeply insecure man. Tonight, I wore a striking, deep crimson custom power suit, commanding the room. My posture was flawless. My presence was unquestionable. I finally understood that hiding my success had never been an act of humility. It had been a trauma response, a defense mechanism to survive next to a man who fed on my insecurity. Bradley had demanded that I stay small so he could feel strong. I had allowed myself to be a spectator in my own empire, wrongly believing that protecting his fragile ego was the price of domestic peace. I knew now that peace bought at the expense of self-erasure is nothing but a gilded cage. Stepping into the brilliant, absolute light of my own power wasn't just a choice, it was my true calling. I moved through the crowd, greeting founders and innovators who held the same hungry, brilliant spark I had when I sold my first logistics company. I shook hands with a woman who had just patented a revolutionary clean energy algorithm. I finalized a massive seed funding round with a young developer who had been completely ignored by every male-dominated venture capital firm in the city. I looked into their eyes and saw the same resilience that had carried me through years of mental abuse. By funding them, I wasn't just expanding my portfolio. I was actively dismantling the systematic corporate arrogance that men like Bradley and Mr. Montgomery relied on to maintain their unearned dominance. I was building an army of apex predators. Across the sea of crimson and black power suits, I caught sight of the two men who had stood firmly beside me when the battlefield was at its darkest. Leah was in deep conversation with a brilliant software engineer, likely recruiting her for an executive role at Apex AI. He looked up, catching my eye across the room, and offered a sharp, triumphant nod. Leo had secured his merger on our terms, completely bypassing the corrupt executives who had tried to compromise his vision. Apex AI was now the undisputed crown jewel of the tech sector, operating safely under the massive umbrella of my financial empire. Jamal stood near the main bar, radiating his usual calm, lethal authority. My new chief information security officer had integrated into Vanguard Holdings with perfect efficiency. Within his first week, he had completely overhauled our data infrastructure, making our corporate servers absolutely impenetrable. He was no longer the disrespected outsider forced to fix routers at miserable family dinners. He was a highly compensated, deeply respected executive, directing a massive department of elite engineers. Megan, his wife, stood proudly beside him, finally free from the toxic, suffocating influence of her own mother and brother. She raised her glass to me, her smile radiating pure, unadulterated joy. I stepped toward the center of the room, signaling the servers to distribute vintage champagne. As the crystal flutes were passed around, the room fell into a natural silence. The brilliant, powerful women turned their attention to the front of the suite. Leo and Jamal moved through the crowd, taking their places on either side of me, completing my inner circle. This was my chosen family. We were bound not by the superficial, greedy obligations of blood, but by absolute loyalty, unmatched intelligence, and the shared victory of crushing a fraudulent dynasty. I took a glass of crystal champagne from a passing tray. I looked at Jamal, who had risked his livelihood to hand me the ultimate weapon. I looked at Leo, who had bowed his head in a crowded restaurant to remind the world exactly who I was. I looked at the 50 extraordinary women who were about to reshape the global economy with my capital. I felt the absolute rush of freedom wash over me, a feeling more intoxicating than any financial valuation. I raised my glass high. The crystal caught the final rays of the setting sun, flashing like a diamond against the Chicago skyline. To the women who refused to make themselves small, I declared, my voice echoing with crisp, unwavering authority. To the empires we build in the shadows, to the boundaries we enforce without mercy, and to the undeniable, beautiful truth that no one ever again gets to decide our worth. The room erupted into applause. Glasses clinked together, a roaring, celebratory symphony of absolute victory. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive champagne. It tasted like absolute independence, unbreakable boundaries, and the incredibly sweet, flawless flavor of absolute karma.